Hi there. I'm glad you found a quiet corner of your evening to spend with me. Before anything else, let yourself get comfortable. Sink into your pillow or your couch, or wherever you've chosen to rest tonight, because in a few minutes I am going to take you somewhere very far from here, to a night that happened before writing, before cities, before almost everything we call history. And at the center of that night there is a family, just like yours, just like mine. Picture this. A mother sits beside a small fire deep inside a crack in a pale limestone cliff. Her children are curled up next to her, half asleep, listening to sounds outside they do not yet have a word for. This family lived and loved more than 100,000 years before either of us was born, and for all that time, across all those winters, they left behind only 9 small teeth. Tonight, we're going to find out why those 9 little teeth quietly rewrote what scientists thought they understood about family, about love, and about belonging. Before we step into their world, I want to ask you for something small, but it means a lot to me. If stories like this one give you even a little spark of wonder, a little chill on your skin, please tap that like button. It costs you nothing, but it tells me you want more nights like this one. And if you are new around here, hitting subscribe means you will not miss the next chapter of the family we are about to meet tonight. Oh, and one more thing. I always love reading where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Drop it in the comments below. Somehow knowing there are people scattered all over this planet, listening to the very same story at the very same moment, that never quite stops feeling a little magical to me. Now go ahead, turn the lights down as low as you can. If you have a fan nearby, turn it on just for that soft, steady hum in the background. It helps the whole story feel more real right here in the room with you. Pull up your blanket, settle your head on the pillow, and when you are ready, let's go back. Back past your parents and their parents and every parent before them, all the way to a night that time almost forgot. Long ago, in a place that did not yet have a name, winter was settling over the hills of what would one day become southern Poland. The land was rougher, then colder, older, in a way that is hard to picture from where you're lying right now. There were no roads, no fences, no lights on any horizon, just forest and stone and sky stretching out in every direction, mile after mile, with almost nothing to interrupt them. Thick forest gave way to open, storm-worn ridges of pale rock, the kind that had been standing there since long before there were eyes to look at them. And somewhere among those ridges a narrow crack in the stone opened into a hollow, just wide enough to keep a family safe from the dark. Inside that hollow a small fire glowed against the rock, throwing soft orange light across the walls. Smoke drifted up toward a ceiling blackened by 1,000 fires. Before this one, though, of course no one inside was counting. This particular evening was not special, at least not to the people living it. It was simply one more night in a very long chain of nights, each one almost exactly like the last. Which, as it turns out, is precisely why it matters so much to us now. A woman sat near the flames, working a scrap of hide between her hands, turning it over, softening it, the way her own mother had probably taught her once long before. Beside her 2 children pushed and jostled for the warmest spot by the fire. Family life, it turns out, has not changed nearly as much as we like to think. The older child, a boy of maybe 8 or 9 winters, was gnawing on the last shred of meat, clinging to a bone, holding it a little too tight against his chest, like he expected his sister to make a grab for it. Which, to be fair, she absolutely was planning to do. She tried anyway, of course, reaching one small hand toward the bone the moment her brother's attention slipped for even a second. He caught her wrist without even looking, an old practiced move that suggested this exact negotiation had played out many, many times before. Some things about siblings, it seems, are simply timeless. The younger one, a girl no older than 4, had already lost interest in food. She was watching the fire instead the way children have always watched fire caught by something they cannot yet explain. Every so often a spark would lift into the air and vanish into the dark above them, and she would gasp just a little, as if it were the most astonishing thing she had ever seen. Maybe it was. For a moment, everything in that hollow of rock felt almost too peaceful. Then somewhere beyond the entrance a branch snapped. Not near, not urgent, but enough. The woman's hand froze mid-motion hide, forgotten her whole body tilted very slightly toward the sound. The boy stopped chewing. Even the little girl who'd been lost in the fire a moment earlier went still, watching her mother's face the way children do when they're trying to decide whether or not to be afraid. A few long seconds passed. Then the woman relaxed just barely and went back to her work as if nothing had happened at all. Whatever had made that sound had already moved on, but that instant, that small flicker of alertness tells you almost everything you need to know about what it meant to raise children in a world like this one. Every quiet evening was built on top of 1,000 small decisions about danger, decisions made so quickly and so quietly that the children beside the fire never even noticed them being made. She was not a delicate woman, this mother. Years of cold mornings and long walks over broken rock had shaped strong arms, rough hands, a face that had weathered more storms than any calendar could ever count. But her eyes watching her children over the fire were unmistakably entirely human. Equal parts love and low-grade worry, the exact same look you have probably seen on your own mother's face at some point in your life, whether she was watching you cross a busy street or simply fall asleep on the couch. Outside, past the narrow mouth of the cave, the night had a rhythm all its own. Somewhere out on the ridge, deep grunts and heavy footsteps drifted through the cold air, perhaps a woolly rhinoceros passing by, perhaps something else entirely. The icy air pressed against the rock but did not enter. That crack in the stone, barely wide enough for a grown adult to slip through sideways, was not just a hiding place. In its own quiet way, it was the difference between staying safe through the night and not. Near the fire, a scatter of dark stone flakes caught the light, each one chipped and shaped by hand, sharp enough to cut through hide, through wood, through the tough sinew that held a life together out here. There was nothing crude or careless about this family. Every tool by that fire had taken skill, patience, and knowledge passed down through more hands than anyone could ever count. Whoever first taught this woman how to strike stone against stone until it broke just right, they were probably gone by now, remembered only in the shape of her hands as she worked. And here is the part I want you to sit with for a moment, because this ordinary little evening tucked into an ordinary little cave was about to become one of the most important nights in the entire story of who we are. Not because anything dramatic happened, almost the opposite. At some point the girl grew tired of watching the fire and crawled into her mother's lap instead, tucking her head beneath her chin. The woman shifted the hide she'd been working and wrapped it round her daughter's shoulders instead, then began to hum low, almost under her breath, more feeling than melody. We do not know what song that was. We will never know. But somewhere in the deep human part of your chest right now listening to this, you probably understand that hum anyway. The boy, meanwhile, had gone quiet too, chewing on the same worn scrap of hide he always chewed when he was thinking hard about something. A moment later he made a small sound somewhere between a laugh and a wince, and reached up to his own mouth. A tooth, loose for days, finally free. He held it out toward his mother, a small pale shape resting in his palm, proud, in the way only a child losing a tooth can be proud. She looked at it for a long moment, turned it over once between her fingers, and then pressed it gently into a fold of warm ash near the edge of the fire, tucking it away like something worth keeping safe. She had no way of knowing it, of course. No one in that cave could have known it. But that small ordinary act, a mother tucking her son's tooth into the ash, was quietly becoming one of the most important gestures in the story of human origins. because more than 100,000 years later, someone was going to find it. Now let's step out of that firelight for a moment because I want to show you something. Fast forward past every winter this family could not have imagined surviving. Past the slow rise and fall of ice sheets that would come and go and come again. Past the disappearance of the woolly rhinoceros and the mammoth from these hills entirely. Past the invention of writing, past kingdoms and wars and the moon landing, all the way to a quiet afternoon, not so long ago at all, in that same patch of pale hills, in what we now call southern Poland. A researcher kneels in the dirt at the back of a narrow cave, brushing away centuries of dust, with a small, soft-bristled tool moving slower than you would believe a person could move on purpose. Nearby, a small team works in near silence. The only sounds a faint scrape of metal on stone and somewhere outside birdsong that this family beside the fire would have recognized instantly. Then something small and pale catches the light. A tooth. The researcher's hand stops moving entirely. For a second, nobody breathes. Then a quiet voice calls the rest of the team over, careful, almost reverent, the way you might call someone over to see a sleeping baby, rather than a fossil buried in dirt for longer than anyone can properly imagine. It does not look like much. Barely the size of your smallest fingernail, worn smooth by more time than the human mind can comfortably hold. But to the team working that site, this tiny piece of enamel was about to answer a question no one had ever fully answered before. Who exactly were the people who once called this narrow crack in the rock home? Not just where they came from, not just how they hunted or built fire or shaped stone into tools. Something far more personal than that, something about family. That tooth and the others found beside it belonged to a species of humans who lived and loved and lost each other long before our kind of human ever set foot in Europe. We call them Neanderthals, and for a very long time most of us assumed we understood them well enough already. Slow, simple, doomed by their own limits. We were wrong. And the family in that cave, the woman by the fire, the boy with the loose tooth, the girl humming herself to sleep in her mother's lap, they're about to help prove it. Not through some grand discovery, no lost city, no golden treasure. Just a handful of teeth small enough to fit in the palm of your hand, patient enough to wait more than 100,000 years for someone to finally understand what they meant. So here is the question I want you to carry with you as we go further into this story tonight. If a family this small, this ordinary, this tender, really did once share that fire together, connected by the same blood and the same warmth and the same small fears in the dark, then what does that mean for everything we thought we knew about the people we call a little too simply cavemen? To answer that, we cannot start with the woman or the fire or the tooth resting in her palm. We have to start with the ground itself, with the strange, narrow little cave that kept all of this safe for longer than almost any place on Earth. A cave that, funny enough, would one day be given a name that has nothing at all to do with ancient humans. A name, as you are about to hear, that almost feels like a joke history decided to play on all of us. Alright, let's get to that name because I promised you it was almost a joke and I meant it. In the local language, the cave carries a name that has nothing to do with ancient humans at all. Translated into English, it simply means the stable, as in a place where you keep horses. For a very long time, that was more or less exactly what people around there used it for, a convenient shelter for animals tucked into the rock, useful in the way any dry hollow in a hillside is useful to a farmer with livestock and no barn nearby. Try to sit with that for a second. Somewhere beneath the hooves of ordinary farm horses inside a hollow, most people probably walked past without a second glance. There was a family whose bloodline would eventually rewrite an entire chapter of human history. Nobody names a place after what they think it might become. They name it after what it looks like on a random Tuesday afternoon. And on a random Tuesday afternoon, this particular crack in the rock looked exactly like what it was being used for animal shelter, nothing more. I find that oddly comforting, honestly. How many ordinary, unremarkable corners of your own life are you walking past right now without realizing what they might actually hold? Now, where exactly are we? This cave sits up in the hill country of southern Poland, in a region locals call the upland between the cities of Krakow and Częstochowa, a stretch of pale limestone ridges that has been quietly shaping the landscape there for longer than most rock formations on this planet. The entrance itself rests at just under 1,200 feet above sea level, which does not sound especially dramatic until you are standing there, cold air tugging at your jacket, looking out across a landscape of jagged white cliffs, poking up out of green farmland like the bones of some much older world pushing through the surface. It is quiet country. Sheep country mostly, and hiking trails and small stone farmhouses that look like they have been sitting in the same spot forever, which compared to almost everything we're about to discuss tonight they more or less have. If you drove through it today on your way somewhere else entirely, there is a very good chance you would not even slow down. And here is a detail I love. The cave sits almost exactly between two small villages, Mirów and Bobolis, each one with its own crumbling half-rebuilt medieval castle on a nearby hilltop. Real stone fortresses built roughly in the middle of the 14th century by a Polish king named Casimir the Great meant to guard the western edge of his kingdom. Local legend even gives those two castles their own story completely unrelated to anything we're talking about tonight, but too good not to mention. The tale goes that two brothers once ruled those twin strongholds, and when the younger brother fell for the older brother's beloved tragedy followed betrayal, a killing, and a young woman said to have been sealed alive behind castle walls, doomed to wander them forever afterward as a ghost. Every old castle in that part of the world, it seems, needs its own resident ghost story. This region certainly delivered. But here is what stops me every time I think about it. Those castles with their feuding brothers and their ghost stories are considered ancient by local standards. 700 years old, give or take. Properly old, the kind of old that makes American visitors stop and stare because most buildings back home simply do not reach that age. And yet if you shrink 700 years down to a single step on a staircase, the family we met earlier tonight, the mother, the boy, the girl by the fire, would be standing more than 170 steps further back into the dark behind that castle. The medieval brothers and their feud are not even a rounding error on the timeline we're dealing with here. They are practically yesterday. To give you a sense of scale if you're watching this from somewhere in the United States, the castle was already standing centuries before the Pilgrims ever set foot on Plymouth Rock, before Jamestown existed, before Columbus had even been born, and it is still next to the family we're following tonight, practically a toddler. I only bring this up because I think it is worth pausing on every now and then just how strange and layered a single patch of ground can be. Castles' ghosts, farmers keeping horses, and underneath all of it, quietly waiting a family from 120,000 years earlier. If you have ever stood somewhere ordinary, a parking lot, a backyard, a stretch of highway, and later found out something extraordinary once happened right there, you already know exactly the feeling I am describing. Let's talk about the cave itself for a moment, because I think most people picture something much grander than what actually exists here. When you hear the word cave, your mind probably jumps straight to something like a tourist attraction. Soaring ceilings, dramatic stalactites, maybe a gift shop at the entrance. Forget all of that. This cave is small, properly small. From front to back it stretches roughly 75 feet, which is about the length of 2 school buses parked bumper to bumper. At its widest it is maybe 13 feet across though. In plenty of spots it narrows down to something nearer 6 or 7 feet. Barely wider than a hallway in an average house. The ceiling rises to around 20 feet at its tallest point, roughly the height of a 2-story home, though again that is the generous measurement, not the everyday reality of moving through the space. This was not a cathedral. It was a cruel space with ambition damp in the wrong seasons, drafty near the entrance, and probably smelling faintly of smoke and animal hide most of the time. Nobody was choosing this place for comfort. They were choosing it because it kept them breathing until morning, and out here that was worth far more than comfort ever could be. And that narrowness matters far more than you might expect. When archaeologists eventually studied this site closely, they came to believe the entrance was simply too tight, too restrictive, to have supported a family living there full-time year-round for generations on end. Which means I need to gently correct something from earlier tonight, and I would rather be honest with you than let a beautiful image go unchallenged. That family we pictured together, gathered around their fire, probably was not living in that exact spot every single night of their lives. The evidence instead points towards something more like a seasonal stopover, a favourite resting point visited again and again across generations during hunting trips out into the surrounding hills, rather than a permanent home base. Think less year-round residence and more a well-loved campsite that a family kept returning to, trip after trip, year after year, because it worked, because it was safe, because it was theirs in every sense that mattered, even if they were not there every single night. Does that make the story less moving to you? I have to say it does not for me. If anything, it makes it more moving. This was not just one lucky night captured in stone. This was a place chosen again and again and again across who knows how many seasons by people who clearly knew a good shelter when they found one. Now let's talk about how any of us came to know this cave existed at all, because the excavation story here has its own quiet drama. Local hikers and cave enthusiasts had known about this hollow for generations, of course. It shows up on old regional maps mentioned in passing by geologists studying the limestone ridges nearby. But knowing a cave exists and knowing what is buried inside it are two entirely different things. For decades it was just another hollow in a hillside full of hollows, noted catalogued and then largely ignored, until a mix of scientific curiosity and plain good luck finally brought a research team through its narrow entrance with shovels and sieves instead of sheep. Serious archaeological work at this site began back in 2007 and continued through 2010. A small international team focused their efforts on an area at the back of the cave, covering roughly 170 square feet, smaller than most two-car garages. Picture that for a second. An entire chapter of human history dug out of a space smaller than where you probably park your car. The fieldwork was led in large part by a Polish archaeologist named Mikołaj Urbanowski, working alongside researchers from the University of Wrocław and the Polish Academy of Sciences, patiently sifting through layer after layer of ancient sediment, one careful inch at a time. This is not glamorous work, whatever the documentaries might make it look like. It is slow. It is often uncomfortable. It involves a great deal of kneeling in cold dirt, brushing away crumbs of soil, with tools no bigger than a toothbrush for hours that stretch into days that stretch into years. 4 separate seasons of digging spread out over 4 separate summers in a space barely large enough for 2 people to work comfortably at once. No air conditioning, no convenient lighting, just patience notebooks, small paper bags for every fragment worth keeping, and the quiet, stubborn belief that something worth finding was still down there waiting under one more layer of dirt. And in that very first year, 2007, buried among animal bones and a handful of stone tools, the team found their first human tooth. They had no way of knowing it yet, but that single tooth was only the beginning. Over the following years, more would surface, eventually totaling 9 teeth, in all scattered across different layers of the cave floor, each one waiting patiently for the science that would decades later finally be capable of listening to what they had to say. Here is a small detail I cannot resist sharing with you because it caught me completely off guard the first time I came across it, and I suspect it will do the same for you. When researchers eventually examined a couple of these teeth in fine detail under a microscope, they found tiny telltale grooves worn into the surface near the gum line, the kind of grooves that do not happen naturally, the kind that happen when someone repeatedly, deliberately works a thin, stiff object between their teeth to clear away trapped food. In plain terms, at least one member of this ancient family appears to have used something that worked almost exactly like a toothpick. Have you ever had a piece of food stuck between two back teeth at the worst possible moment and felt that specific maddening little irritation you cannot ignore no matter how hard you try? Congratulations. You now have something remarkably intimate in common with a person who lived over 100,000 years before you were born. I love this detail more than almost anything else in this entire story, and here is why. It is so wonderfully, almost embarrassingly human. We tend to imagine Neanderthals as something far removed from ourselves, more animal than human in most of the pictures painted for us growing up. And then you learn that one of them on some ordinary evening long ago got a scrap of food stuck between two back teeth, found it irritating enough to do something about it, and reach for a twig or a splinter of bone to fix the problem. Tell me that is not exactly what you would do at the dinner table tonight, phone in one hand, toothpick in the other. This was not an isolated habit either. Researchers studying teeth from this same cave have documented more than one example of it, suggesting this was not some strange one-time accident, but an actual repeated practice, something closer to routine than coincidence. Small habits like that one collapse the distance between us and them far more effectively than any chart or diagram ever could. Now I want to give you one more comparison before we move forward, because I think it puts everything we have just covered into proper perspective. Thousands of miles away in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, there is another cave that changed our understanding of ancient humans almost as dramatically as this one. Unlike our narrow, cramped little crack in the rock, that Siberian cave is spacious, bright, high-ceilinged with sweeping views out over a river valley, below the kind of vantage point where you could watch herds of animals coming down to drink from a mile away. Researchers who have worked there sometimes half-jokingly call it a prehistoric penthouse. It is the kind of cave people picture when they hear the word cave roomy enough that entirely different groups of ancient humans over tens of thousands of years apparently took turns calling it home. Our cave tonight offered none of that. No sweeping view, no roomy gallery, just a tight, awkward crack in a hillside that a family kept returning to anyway season after season, because usefulness mattered far more than scenery ever did. And yet both sites, the Grand Siberian Penthouse and our modest little Polish stable, ended up delivering discoveries of almost equal weight to our understanding of who we once were. One cave impressed you the moment you walked inside it. The other one, our cave tonight, would never win any beauty contest. I think there is a real lesson buried in that contrast, and it has nothing to do with archaeology specifically. The most important places in your own life are rarely the ones that look important from the outside. They are the ordinary, easily overlooked ones, a kitchen table, a back porch, a narrow little room somewhere that quietly end up holding the moments that shape everything that comes after. So we now know where this family kept returning to generation after generation. We know what the cave looked like, how it was later used by farmers who had absolutely no idea what lay in the dirt beneath their horses, and we know that a small team of researchers spent years on their knees in the cold, patiently coaxing 9 small teeth out of the ground. But knowing where those teeth came from is only half the story. The far more difficult, far more astonishing question still waits ahead of us. What exactly could 9 small teeth, some barely larger than a grain of rice, possibly tell scientists about the people who once carried them, about their relationships, their movements, and whether that woman by the fire really was, in the most literal biological sense, a mother watching over her own children? It took years of careful laboratory work to even begin answering that question. And honestly, the methods involved sound almost like science fiction. Reading fragments of ancient genetic material out of enamel that has been sitting in cold dirt for over 100,000 years is not simple, and it is not always reliable. More than one research team has been badly fooled by damaged, contaminated, or misleading old samples before, so the scientists who took on these 9 teeth had to be careful, patient, and more than a little bit suspicious of their own early results, double-checking everything, cross-referencing everything, before they were willing to trust what the evidence seemed to be telling them. What they eventually found did not just answer the question. It reshaped an entire scientific debate that had been running for years, and it forced more than one respected expert to quietly reconsider conclusions they had already published. That is where we are headed next, and I promise you the answer surprised even the researchers who uncovered it. A tooth, it turns out, keeps better secrets than almost anything else the human body leaves behind. Skin rots within weeks. Muscle and organs disappear faster than that. Even bone, given enough time, enough moisture, enough hungry bacteria, eventually crumbles into something nearer to soil than skeleton. But enamel, the hard outer shell of a tooth, is the toughest material your entire body produces, tougher even than bone itself. It is basically a small stubborn vault, and sometimes if the conditions inside that vault stay cold and dry and undisturbed for long enough, something remarkable survives inside it. Tiny fragile threads of genetic material, the biological instructions that once built an entire living person, cell by cell from the inside out. Scientists call it deoxyribonucleic acid, though I suspect most of us have simply grown up calling it by 3 familiar letters. For our purposes tonight, let's just call it what it really is. A kind of inherited message passed down, parent to child, generation after generation, carrying fragments of a person's story long after everything else about them has turned to dust. So here is the actual question researchers were facing with these 9 little teeth. Could they pull a legible message out of genetic material that had been sitting in cold cave dirt for nearing 100,000 years? Let me be honest with you about the odds here, because I think it makes the eventual success far more impressive. Most attempts like this fail. Genetic material this old is often too broken down, too contaminated by bacteria, fungus, or even the very hands of the researchers digging it up to produce anything usable at all. Plenty of ancient teeth from plenty of important sites around the world have been tested and have simply come back silent, offering nothing but disappointment after months of painstaking laboratory work. This is not the glossy instant results you see in crime dramas where a technician runs a sample and gets a clean answer in under a minute. Real ancient genetic research is more like trying to make sense of a love letter that has spent 10,000 years at the bottom of a lake water, damaged, torn, most of the ink long since faded past recognition, and somehow occasionally still partially legible if you know exactly where and how to look. The team that eventually cracked open the story of these 9 teeth was led by a researcher named Andrea Piscine, working out of the University of Bologna in Italy, alongside a wider group of specialists spread across several countries. And what they managed to pull from these small fragments of enamel ended up being described by more than one expert in the field as an extraordinary result in its own right, the kind that does not come along often in this line of work. Picture the actual process for a moment, because it is far stranger and far more delicate than most people imagine. Researchers working with material this fragile do not simply crack a tooth open on a lab bench. They work inside clean rooms built almost like surgical suites, wrapped head to toe in white protective suits, gloves, masks, hair nets, every square inch of exposed skin covered because a single stray skin cell from a careless researcher could easily contaminate a sample and ruin months of careful work. Using a tiny, precise drill, they bore a narrow hole into the root of the tooth, extracting a small amount of fine powder, and from that powder painstakingly they attempt to coax out any surviving fragments of genetic material still clinging on after all this time. It is worth mentioning that none of this technology existed even a generation ago. The entire field of studying ancient genetic material from fossils is remarkably young, built largely on techniques pioneered by a Swedish researcher named Svante Pääbo's work, considered so groundbreaking that it eventually earned him one of science's highest honours. Everything the Stajnia team accomplished stands on methods that simply did not exist when most of our own parents were growing up. That is worth remembering next time someone tells you that science moves too slowly to matter within a single human lifetime. And even when a sample does yield something, it is rarely a complete tidy result. Most people picture examining old genetic material the way you might go through a book, from cover to cover, start to finish, every page intact. The reality looks nothing like that. It is more like being handed a shredded document, thousands of tiny scraps mixed together in a box, most of them damaged beyond any use, a handful still bearing a few legible words, if you are patient enough and lucky enough to piece them back together in the right order. Researchers spend months doing exactly that digitally, painstakingly matching fragment to fragment, before they can say with any confidence what the assembled message actually says. Have you ever tried piecing together an old, half-destroyed photograph, one that has been left in a damp attic for decades, curling at the edges, half the image faded into nothing? That is roughly the technical challenge these researchers were up against, except instead of a photograph, they were reconstructing fragments of an actual biological identity. Working under careful contamination-controlled laboratory conditions, the team managed to extract usable genetic material from 8 of the 9 teeth found in that cave. And from those 8 samples, they were able to identify at least 7 separate individuals, possibly 8 who had once carried these teeth in their own mouths, chewing, biting, living entire lives we will never fully know the details of. 7 separate people, not 7 scattered unrelated fossils pulled from 7 different corners of the ancient world, which is usually how these stories go. 7 individuals from the very same small cave, apparently connected to one another, in some way existing within roughly the same slice of time. I want you to sit with that for just a second, because in this particular field of research that is almost unheard of, most of what we know about early human relatives comes from single isolated fossils. A tooth here, a fragment of skull there, scattered across different countries and different eras, forcing scientists to stitch together a story from puzzle pieces that rarely belong to the same puzzle. This cave offered something entirely different. A cluster, a group, possibly, and here is where the story gets personal, fast, an actual family. But before we get to that particular reveal, and trust me, it is coming, I want to walk you through one more piece of the puzzle, because I think it says something important about how careful real science actually has to be, especially when working this far back in time. Normally, when archaeologists want to figure out how old something is, they reach for a method called radiocarbon dating, measuring the slow, predictable decay of a specific element found in anything that was once alive. It has become almost the default tool of the trade, reliable, well-tested, trusted around the world. Except radiocarbon dating has a hard limit. Past roughly 50,000 years, the signal researchers are measuring becomes so faint, so near background noise, that the method essentially stops working with any real confidence. And these teeth, remember, were suspected of being twice that old, maybe more. So the team had to reach for something else entirely, a technique, with a name that sounds more intimidating than it actually is once you break it down, something researchers call molecular branch shortening. Here is the simplest way I can explain it to you. Genetic material accumulates small changes, tiny mutations at a fairly steady, predictable pace, over time, almost like a slow-running clock ticking quietly in the background of every living thing. If you compare an ancient sample against other samples whose ages are already well established, you can count up how many of these small changes have built up, and use that count to estimate roughly how long ago your mystery sample branched off from everyone else. Think of two old friends who lost touch decades ago, each one changing their habits, their style, their little quirks at roughly the same steady pace ever since they went their separate ways. If you sat them down today and tallied up exactly how different they had become from each other, you could make a fairly solid guess at how many years had passed since they last spoke. That more or less is the logic at work here, just swapped out for genetic mutations instead of haircuts and habits. Using this method, the research team placed these individuals somewhere within a window, stretching from roughly 80,000 to 130,000 years ago. A remarkably wide, almost dizzying span of time to even attempt pinning down with any precision, and the team knew it better than anyone. This is where I want to introduce you to another researcher involved in this project, a specialist in dating methods named Sara Talamo, also working out of the University of Bologna. And something she emphasized throughout this research has stuck with me ever since I first came across it, because I think it applies to a lot more than just old teeth. Her argument in plain terms was this: when you're working right at the outer edge of what any dating method can reliably tell you the responsible thing to do is admit exactly how uncertain your answer really is, rather than dressing it up with false confidence just to sound more impressive. Science done properly means resisting the temptation to hand someone a suspiciously tidy specific number when the honest answer is more like a wide, blurry range. I have to admit there is something almost refreshing about that kind of admission. We live in a world absolutely obsessed with false precision weather apps, promising an exact percentage chance of rain down to the decimal point, financial predictions stated with total confidence that quietly ignore how little anyone actually knows about where the markets are headed. There is something almost admirable about a group of scientists standing in front of an enormous, tantalizing discovery and choosing to say carefully, "We believe this falls somewhere in this range," rather than pretending to know more than the evidence actually allows. Has anyone in your own life ever impressed you more by admitting uncertainty than by pretending to have all the answers? I think that instinct, knowing the difference between confidence and honesty, might be one of the most underrated qualities a person can have. Now let's circle back to those 7 individuals, because this is where the story stops being about methodology and starts turning into an actual mystery. Once the research team had usable genetic material from each of these ancient teeth, they began comparing the samples against one another, looking for patterns, looking for connections, looking for anything that might link these 7 or 8 people together beyond simply having shared the same cave at some point. And one particular comparison stopped the entire research team cold. Buried among all the ancient genetic information was a specific kind of evidence, the kind that only ever travels down one single unbroken line passed directly from a mother to every one of her children generation after generation without exception. When researchers looked closely at where this maternal thread led among the Stajnia individuals, they noticed something that, according to people involved with the project, made more than one member of the team stop scrolling through the data and simply stare at their screen for a moment. 3 of these ancient teeth out of the entire group carried an identical version of that maternal thread. Not similar, not closely related in some loose general sense. Identical in the specific technical way that only makes biological sense if those 3 individuals shared the exact same mother or descended from her along the exact same unbroken maternal branch. One researcher on the project, a genetic specialist named Matea Hajdinjak, working at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, was among the first to fully grasp what that particular match seemed to be pointing toward. And based on everything I have learned about how she and her colleagues reacted to it, this was not simply another data point to log and move past. This was the moment the entire project quietly shifted from an interesting population study into something that felt, for lack of a better word, personal. I'm not going to give you the full weight of what that specific match actually revealed just yet, because it deserves its own proper space to breathe rather than being rushed through in the closing minutes of tonight's story. But I will tell you this much. Remember that woman by the fire we spent time with earlier tonight and the 2 children curled up beside her. The scientific evidence sitting behind that image is far more solid and far more moving than I think either of us fully appreciated when we first pictured it. Ask yourself something for a moment. If a laboratory somewhere could prove beyond reasonable doubt that you and your own siblings shared the exact same mother, would that surprise you at all? Probably not. You already know the answer, you lived it. But imagine needing 100,000 years, a drill smaller than a sewing needle, and a small army of specialists in white protective suits just to arrive at a conclusion that for most of us is simply an obvious fact of family life. That gap between what we take completely for granted and what science has to labour for years to prove says something quietly beautiful about how much of being human simply is not written down anywhere except inside our own bodies. Before we get there, though, I think it is worth pausing to appreciate just how strange this entire process really is if you step back and look at it plainly. A group of scientists working in bright, sterile laboratories thousands of miles from that ancient cave spent years coaxing whispers of information out of objects smaller than a pencil eraser, using techniques that did not even exist 20 years ago, just to answer a question that on the surface sounds almost embarrassingly simple. Were these people, this specific handful of individuals, actually related to one another? And they were able to answer it. Not with total certainty on every single point, science rarely offers that kind of tidy certainty, but with enough confidence built on enough careful, patient, honest work to fundamentally change how we picture life inside that narrow little cave. I think there is something worth sitting with in that beyond the specific discovery itself. So much of what gets called history is really just a story about what evidence happened to survive long enough for someone patient enough to come looking for it. Most of that woman's life, her name, her voice, the song she actually hummed is gone forever and always will be. But one small, stubborn piece of her locked inside enamel harder than anything else her body ever produced waited in the dark for 100,000 years, patient enough to eventually tell part of her story to people who would not exist for another 1,000 centuries. That is not just good science. That to me feels like something almost sacred. So here is where we leave things for the moment. 7, possibly 8 individuals confirmed through careful genetic work to have shared that narrow little cave sometime between 80,000 and 130,000 years ago. Among them 3 teeth carrying an identical maternal thread, a connection strong enough to make seasoned researchers stop and take notice. What that connection actually means, who these 3 individuals likely were to one another, and why it would go on to reshape scientific assumptions about an entire vanished species, that is exactly where we are headed next, and I do not think you will want to miss it. Okay, I did promise you an answer, and I am not going to make you wait any longer for it. Those 3 teeth, the ones carrying an identical maternal thread, did not belong to 3 random adults, who simply happened to share a distant ancestor somewhere far back in time. When researchers looked closely at the physical structure of each tooth, the wear patterns, the stage of a root development, the sheer size of the thing, 2 of the 3 turned out to belong to children, young ones. The 3rd belonged to a fully grown adult. Sit with that combination for just a second. 1 adult, 2 children. All 3 connected by a genetic thread that only ever passes from a mother down to the children she carried and raised herself. You might be wondering how anyone could possibly know a person's rough age just from a single tooth. And honestly, the answer is one of my favourite small details in this entire story. Teeth grow in layers almost the same way a tree trunk adds a new ring every year. Inside the enamel and the root, researchers can count fine growth lines under a microscope, incremental markers laid down steadily as a child develops month after month, year after year. A fully formed adult tooth root complete surface worn down by decades of chewing tells a completely different story than a tooth, still mid-formation, roots only partly grown enamel barely finished settling into place. It is in its own strange way a kind of biological calendar quietly ticking away inside every one of us, long before we are ever old enough to understand what a calendar even is. You do not need an advanced degree in genetics to feel where this is heading. Now I want to walk you through exactly how careful, honest researchers actually talk about a finding like this, because I think it says something valuable about the difference between a story that sounds good and a story that is actually true. The team working on this did not stand up at a conference and declare with total confidence that they had absolutely identified a mother and her 2 children. That is not how responsible science works, and frankly I trust this discovery more precisely because they refused to oversell it. What they said in careful measured language was that this pattern strongly suggested one of these 3 individuals may have been the mother of the other 2. Notice that word may. It is doing a lot of quiet, honest work in that sentence. Could there be other explanations? Technically, yes. An older sister could theoretically share identical maternal genetic material with 2 younger siblings, since brothers and sisters from the same mother carry that same unbroken thread too. An aunt could match a niece and nephew the exact same way. Genetics alone, working from this one particular type of evidence, cannot draw a perfect unbreakable circle around the word mother specifically. But here is where I want to offer you my own honest opinion for a moment because I think it matters. When you take the raw genetic match and lay it directly on top of everything else, these researchers observed an adult tooth paired with 2 teeth belonging to children still young enough to be actively growing, still developing, sharing that exact same living space. The far simpler, far more probable explanation is the one that requires the least amount of guesswork. A mother with her 2 children. Not an elaborate chain of half-sisters and long-lost cousins who all happen to end up in the same small cave together. Sometimes the boring, obvious answer really is the correct one, and I think this is one of those times. Here is a detail that made this discovery even more remarkable to the people working on it. These 3 specific teeth were not all pulled from the exact same spot, or even the exact same depth inside that cave floor. Now, before that fact makes you doubt anything, let me explain why it actually strengthens the story rather than weakening it. Caves like this one are not neat, orderly filing cabinets with each year of history stacked cleanly on top of the last. Over tens of thousands of winters, water seeps in, freezes, expands and thaws again over and over, physically pushing and churning the soil and everything buried inside it. Small animals dig through it, roots grow through it. The ground itself quite literally shifts and settles and mixes over an almost unimaginable stretch of time. Researchers studying this particular cave have specifically noted that its internal layers show clear signs of this kind of natural disturbance, meaning depth alone cannot always be trusted as a reliable clock for figuring out exactly how old something is. So finding these 3 related teeth scattered across slightly different layers does not necessarily mean these 3 people lived generations apart from one another. It more likely means the ground itself did exactly what disturbed cave sediment tends to do over an almost incomprehensible span of time. Shuffle things around like an old tired card dealer who has been dealing the same deck for 100,000 years straight. If you remember the 2 children we spent time with right at the very beginning of tonight's story, a boy around 8 or 9 winters old and a younger girl no older than 4, I want you to notice something. The ages researchers estimated for these two young individuals based purely on tooth development line up remarkably well with exactly that kind of gap, a slightly older child and a considerably younger one. I am not telling you those exact two children definitely lived exactly as pictured word for word. Nobody can honestly claim that level of certainty about specific individuals from this deep in time. But the general shape of that family, a mother, an older child, and a much younger one, matches the physical evidence closely enough that our earlier picture was not simply comforting fiction. It was at the very least a strikingly plausible one. Let's talk for a moment about what this actually tells us about how these people lived, because I think this is where the discovery stops being a fascinating footnote and starts meaningfully reshaping the bigger picture. For a long time, popular imagination pictured Neanderthals as isolated, almost feral wanderers, small scattered bands stumbling through an unforgiving landscape with little in the way of lasting emotional bonds. Tough, simple, driven purely by survival instinct. That image has been fading for years now among people who actually study this species closely. And this particular family adds one more solid brick to the wall being built against it. A mother caring for two children of clearly different ages tells us something quietly important. It tells us this was not a group where the very old and the very young were left to fend entirely for themselves. It suggests sustained ongoing parental investment, the kind that requires protecting, feeding and teaching a child for years, not weeks. Raising a 4-year-old and a 9-year-old simultaneously in an environment with actual predators, genuine cold and real food scarcity, is not something a scattered, purely survival-driven creature manages by accident. It requires planning. It requires patience. Frankly, if you have ever managed two children of noticeably different ages at the same time yourself, you already know exactly the kind of quiet, relentless coordination that demands. There is a broader idea in anthropology sometimes called the grandmother hypothesis. The notion that one reason human beings, and quite possibly our Neanderthal relatives too, evolve such unusually long lifespans compared to other animals, is precisely because older individuals, particularly older women, played a critical role in helping raise the next generation. Not just mothers, but mothers of mothers. Extra hands, extra patience, extra decades of accumulated knowledge about which plants were safe to eat and which parts of the forest turned dangerous once the light started fading. We do not have direct proof that a grandmother was present in this particular cave on this particular night. I want to be honest with you about that. But the broader pattern, families investing heavily in their youngest member's generation, supporting generation, fits neatly into a much larger, well-documented story about why creatures like us slow growing painfully vulnerable for years after birth ever managed to survive at all. Every single one of us alive today is in a very real sense descended from an unbroken chain of caregivers who chose to stay and to help rather than walk away. Now I want to bring in one more piece of evidence from a completely different site, because I think it adds a fascinating extra layer to everything we have just covered, and it comes from thousands of miles away. In a cave called Chagiorskaya, tucked into the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, an entirely separate team of researchers made a strikingly similar discovery a few years before this one, working with slightly younger remains, somewhere around 54,000 years old, uncovered inside what once looked like a modest riverside hunting camp, rather than anywhere particularly special. Using a more detailed genetic technique, one that examines far more than just the maternal thread we discussed earlier tonight, sequencing enough of the wider genetic blueprint to trace both maternal and paternal lines, at once they were able to confirm something remarkable. A father and his own teenage daughter living and eventually dying at the very same site, Alongside that father and daughter, the team identified several other relatives within the same small group, painting a picture of a tightly connected community, somewhere around 10 to 20 individuals in total. And here is the detail I find absolutely fascinating. When they study the genetic diversity within that group more closely, they notice something curious. The male members of this community showed far less genetic variation among themselves than the females did. What does that pattern actually suggest? It points toward a specific kind of social structure, one where young males tended to stay put, remaining within the community they were born into for their entire lives, while young females, once they came of age, tended to leave, moving off to join other unrelated groups elsewhere. Now hold on to that idea for a second, because I think it connects beautifully back to our own family here at Stajnia. Remember from earlier tonight, the maternal genetic thread carried by this mother and her children was not unique to this one small Polish cave. That exact same thread has turned up in Neanderthal remains recovered from locations as distant as the Iberian Peninsula, southeastern France, and the northern Caucasus, an almost absurd spread across the entire continent for a species we once assumed rarely travelled far from home. Here is my own honest take on why that spread makes complete sense once you put these two discoveries side by side. If young Neanderthal women really did routinely leave their birth families to join new communities elsewhere, exactly as the Siberian evidence suggests, that single, ordinary, repeated pattern of behaviour, generation after generation, would be more than enough all on its own to carry one particular maternal lineage across an entire continent over tens of thousands of years. Not through some grand deliberate migration, just through the quiet personal choices of individual young women, again and again, each one simply moving toward wherever life or love or opportunity happened to take them next. Does that not feel oddly familiar to you? People leaving home to build a life somewhere new, carrying a piece of their family with them wherever they go, is not some strange exotic Neanderthal behaviour. It is quite literally one of the oldest and most human patterns we know of. I want to pause here and ask you something, if you do not mind. Have you ever thought about how many generations of women in your own family tree packed up everything they knew and moved somewhere unfamiliar for reasons ranging from love to survival to simple ambition? You're very likely sitting exactly where you are right now, watching this because of choices like that one made by women whose names you may not even remember anymore. I think there is something worth sitting with in that parallel. We tend to imagine deep history as something fundamentally alien to our own lives, populated by strange distant creatures who barely resemble us. And then evidence like this arrives quietly, patiently, and reminds us that the underlying architecture of family, the instinct to protect your children, the choice to leave home in search of something better, has apparently been running through our extended family tree for well over 100,000 years, largely unchanged. There is a small, almost funny irony buried in all of this too, if you think about it. Today people spend considerable amounts of money on home genetic testing kits, mailing off a bit of saliva, just to settle casual arguments about family resemblance or distant ancestry, or to finally win a long-running debate about which relative the new baby actually takes after. Meanwhile, it took an international team of specialists years of painstaking laboratory work and equipment that did not exist a generation ago just to confirm what most families already assume about each other, without a single test required. I suppose even 100,000 years later, we're all still on some level just trying to figure out who belongs to whom. Would you have needed a laboratory to guess that a woman surrounded by 2 children, feeding them, protecting them, humming them quietly to sleep was probably their mother? I doubt it. And yet here we are, celebrating exactly that conclusion as a landmark scientific achievement. Sometimes the most advanced tools in the world exist simply to prove with total confidence something the human heart already understood instinctively the entire time. So here is where this particular thread of the story leaves us. A mother, 2 children, a pattern of care and protection stretched across at least 2 different generations of a young growing family, and a genetic signature so widely scattered across an entire continent that it forces us to imagine an ancient world far more connected, far more mobile, and far more emotionally rich than the tired old picture of the solitary grunting caveman ever allowed for. Think about the sheer physical distance involved here for a moment. We're not talking about one small maternal lineage drifting a few valleys over from where it started. We're talking about a genetic signature that eventually turns up in the mountains of northern Spain, along the coastline of southeastern France, and deep into the Caucasus region between the Black Sea and the Caspian, thousands of miles apart, long before anything resembling a road, a map, or a wheel existed anywhere on the planet. That raises an even bigger question, one that stretches far beyond just this one small family in this one small cave. If Neanderthal women really were moving across such enormous distances generation after generation on foot, through forests, over mountain passes, across rivers with no bridges and no boats, what does that actually tell us about the wider world these people were navigating? What was the physical landscape itself like? How was the climate shifting beneath their feet from one century to the next? And just how much ground could an ancient family walking, hunting and surviving together realistically cover across the span of a single determined lifetime? That is exactly the territory we're about to step into next, and I promise you it stretches a great deal farther than one small cave in Poland. Let's actually answer that question, because the scale of it caught me off guard the first time I looked into it properly. For most of the 20th century, the popular image of a Neanderthal community was something small, cramped, and almost claustrophobic. A handful of families huddled in one valley, maybe wandering a few dozen miles across familiar hunting grounds, rarely if ever crossing paths with anyone from outside their own tight little circle. Isolated, provincial in the most literal sense of the word, the kind of people who frankly never left home. You've probably seen the version of this image without even realizing it tucked into the corner of some natural history museum, a dusty diorama behind glass, a single family frozen mid-pose outside a single cave, mouth spear in hand, staring blankly at nothing in particular. That image has shaped how generations of us pictured this entire species, a species reduced to one still frame, one location, one narrow slice of an entire sprawling existence. It is a compelling image. It also happens to be almost entirely misleading. That picture is not just slightly off, it is almost backwards. Take the maternal lineage we've been following tonight. That specific genetic thread, the one carried by our mother and her 2 children, in that narrow Polish cave has also turned up in Neanderthal, remains recovered from the mountains of northern Spain, from the Mediterranean coastline of southeastern France, and from deep within the Caucasus region, wedged between the Black Sea and the Caspian, at a site researchers call Stajnia Cave. That particular Caucasus specimen, when compared letter for letter against our Stajnia family's own genetic signature, turned out to be its nearest known relative anywhere on the entire European continent, nearer even than certain Neanderthal remains found only a few hundred miles away in Western Europe. Let me put those distances into terms that might land a little harder. If you're watching this from somewhere in the United States, the gap between southern Poland and northern Spain is roughly comparable to driving from New York City clear across to Denver, Colorado. The stretch towards southeastern France works out to something more like a drive from New York down to Miami, and the distance to the Caucasus region, tucked between the Black Sea and the Caspian, stretches out to something similar again in almost the opposite direction entirely. We're talking about a single family lineage that somehow left its mark across a stretch of territory nearly as wide as the continental United States itself at a point in history with no roads, no wheeled carts, no horses to ride, and absolutely no maps of any kind. 3 separate regions, 3 enormous distances, one shared thread of ancestry connecting all of them together. How does a family lineage cover that kind of ground without a single one of those conveniences? That question sat with archaeologists for years, honestly more of an open puzzle than a settled answer, until researchers started looking much more closely at the landscape itself rather than just the bones. And that is where rivers enter the story. Picture the terrain of Ice Age Europe for a moment, not as a flat featureless map but as an actual physical landscape, thick forest in some regions, open grassy steppe. In others, mountain ranges rising up like natural walls in between. Travelling in a straight line across that kind of country would have been brutal, exhausting, and in plenty of places nearly impossible. Rivers solve that problem. A river valley offers a natural, gently sloped corridor through otherwise difficult terrain. It offers fresh water at every step. It draws in exactly the kind of migratory animals a hunting family would need to follow anyway. Deer, wild horses, and further south and east the great herds of steppe bison and woolly mammoth. Following a river valley was not simply the easiest option available. In a landscape without any other kind of signpost, it may well have been the only reliable way to navigate at all. Think about it from a purely practical angle for a moment. A family does not need a map if the animals they depend on for food are already doing the navigating for them. Herds of migratory game tend to follow remarkably consistent seasonal routes. The same river crossings, the same sheltered valleys year after year, generation after generation. A family that simply followed the herds and followed the rivers, those herds naturally gathered around, would find themselves drawn steadily along the same corridors, almost without ever having to make a single deliberate decision about which direction led toward food, water, and safety all at once. Researchers studying the tools and genetic patterns from this cave have specifically pointed to 2 particular rivers, the Prut and the Dniester, both flowing generally from the Carpathian region down toward the Black Sea, as the likely natural highway connecting Central Europe with the Caucasus. Follow that river system far enough patiently, generation after generation, and you eventually find yourself standing in an entirely different mountain range thousands of miles from where your family originally started out. Now, I want to bring in a piece of research that truly surprised me, published only very recently, because I think it demonstrates just how seriously scientists are now taking the idea of Neanderthals as capable, confident long-distance travellers. A team including a researcher named Radu Jovita built detailed computer simulations of the ancient landscape itself, mapping out rivers, mountain ranges, elevation changes, and terrain difficulty across a huge stretch of northern Eurasia. This was not guesswork or speculation dressed up as science. The team fed real geographic data into the model actual river gradients, actual mountain elevations, actual seasonal patterns, reconstructed from climate records, and then let the simulation calculate the most efficient possible paths a person on foot could realistically follow. Their goal was simple: feed in everything we know about the physical geography of the time, and then ask the model a straightforward question. Following the easiest available river corridors, how quickly could a group realistically travel from the Caucasus Mountains all the way to the Altai Mountains in Siberia, a straight-line distance of roughly 2,000 miles? The answer stunned quite a few people in the field. According to those simulations, that entire journey could plausibly have been completed in under 2,000 years, provided it happened during one of the warmer climate windows when mountain passes were not sealed off by ice. And remarkably, one of the 2 most likely windows for exactly that kind of movement lines up closely with the very same period our family in Stajnia Cave was alive. The researchers behind that study put it in terms I found remarkably striking. Given the landscape conditions during those warmer stretches, this kind of rapid long-distance movement was not some rare fluke or extraordinary achievement. It was more like an almost unavoidable outcome of simply following the terrain as it naturally presented itself. Let that sink in for a second. We're not talking about one extraordinarily brave individual, some prehistoric explorer setting off alone into the unknown with nothing but grit and a stone axe. Nobody needs to imagine anything quite that dramatic. This was almost certainly a slow, quiet relay stretched out across countless generations. One family moves a little further down a familiar river valley in search of better hunting one particular season. Their children grow up considering that new stretch of territory simply home. Their grandchildren push a little further still, chasing the same herds, following the same water, entirely unaware they were participating in anything resembling a migration at all. If that sounds unlikely to you, consider that people are still doing exactly this today in parts of the world where the old rhythms never really disappeared. The Sami people of northern Scandinavia have herded reindeer along seasonal migration routes for centuries, families following the same valleys. Their grandparents followed, moving between winter and summer grazing grounds, without a single fence deed or formal map guiding the way. The knowledge simply lives in the family, carried forward the same way it must have been carried forward by the family we are following tonight. Spoken, demonstrated, walked generation, folding quietly into generation. Long-distance movement guided by memory, herd behavior, and river geography is not some extinct ancient oddity. In certain corners of this planet, it is still quite literally someone's ordinary Tuesday. Nobody packed a bag and announced they were relocating from Poland to Spain. It happened the way most great historical shifts actually happen, not through one dramatic decision, but through thousands of small, completely ordinary ones, each barely noticeable on its own, adding up into something extraordinary only when you finally step back far enough to see the whole picture at once. Have you ever thought about your own life that way? Very few of us wake up one morning and make one single enormous decision that defines everything afterward. Mostly we drift one small choice at a time, a new job here, a move across town there, until one day we look up and realize we have ended up somewhere our younger self never specifically planned for, yet somehow arrived at anyway, one ordinary decision after another. I think there is something worth sitting with in that parallel, honestly. We tend to imagine history as a series of bold, deliberate turning points, dramatic decisions made by dramatic people. And then evidence like this arrives and gently reminds us that most of what actually shapes the world then and now comes from the accumulated weight of small, unremarkable everyday choices repeated patiently across an enormous stretch of time. I find myself wondering sometimes what the very last member of that family to actually make the final push into a brand new valley must have felt in that particular moment. Did they even notice anything significant was happening at all? Or did it simply feel like any other season? Chasing familiar herds a little further than usual, setting up camp beside a bend in a river that looked for all practical purposes almost exactly like the last 100 bends they had already passed. History rarely announces itself while it is actually happening. Most of the time it only looks like history once enough distance and enough centuries have quietly piled up behind it. Here is a small, almost funny thought I keep coming back to. Most of us today cannot walk from one side of an unfamiliar shopping mall to the other without pulling out a phone for directions. Meanwhile, a family with no writing system, no compass, and absolutely no satellite floating overhead apparently navigated successfully across a stretch of territory wider than most modern countries, using nothing but rivers, herds of animals and knowledge passed down carefully from parent to child. I do not know about you, but that puts my own occasional wrong turn at a highway interchange into some fairly humbling perspective. There is a deeper point buried underneath all of this too, one that goes beyond simply being impressed by ancient navigation skills. This kind of sustained movement requires an enormous amount of accumulated environmental knowledge passed down faithfully across generations. Someone had to remember which river bends flooded dangerously in early spring. Someone had to know roughly where the herds tended to gather as the season shifted. Someone had to teach their children patiently, year after year, exactly how to interpret a landscape that could just as easily kill them as feed them. Picture for a moment an older member of that family walking beside a child along a familiar riverbank, pointing out small details most of us would walk right past without a second glance. That particular bend always floods once the snow starts melting up in the hills. That grove of trees marks where the deer tend to gather once the weather turns cold. That distant shape on the horizon is not simply a hill, it is a landmark, a signal, a piece of a much larger mental map being handed down piece by piece, the same way you might have once been taught which street corners were safe to cross alone, or which shortcuts actually saved you time on the way home from school. The information looks different. The underlying instinct teaching a child how to safely make sense of the world around them is exactly the same. That is not the behavior of a simple instinct-driven creature reacting blindly to its surroundings. That is the behavior of a species carrying forward a genuine living body of knowledge, refined and tested across countless generations, passed carefully from one set of hands to the next. When you consider it that way, the label we have used for over a century, caveman, starts to feel almost embarrassingly small for what the actual evidence is showing us. What piece of practical knowledge did someone in your own family bother teaching you patiently more than once, before you finally understood why it actually mattered? A recipe, a shortcut, a warning about a particular stretch of road best avoided after dark. Multiply that ordinary quiet act of teaching across thousands of generations, stretched over tens of thousands of years and thousands of miles of unfamiliar terrain, and you start to get some sense of the sheer accumulated weight of knowledge this one small family was quietly carrying with them. So think back for just a moment to that mother we met earlier tonight, tucked into her narrow little cave with her 2 children beside the fire. Whatever knowledge allowed her family to survive in that specific patch of the world did not appear out of nowhere. It was inherited quite literally from a long chain of ancestors who had already tested this same landscape, or landscapes very much like it, stretching back across an almost unimaginable span of time and distance. Every choice she made that particular night, where to build the fire, which direction to face the entrance, how long to let the children sleep before the coldest part of the night arrived, was quietly informed by generations of trial, error, and hard-won experience that had travelled one small decision at a time across an entire continent to reach her. And that raises a question I think deserves its own proper space to explore. What exactly was that landscape actually like, moment to moment, season to season, for the people living through it? Not simply where they walked, which we have spent tonight uncovering, but what the actual world around them looked like, felt like, and how dramatically it kept shifting beneath their feet as the climate itself rose and fell across the many thousands of years this family's story unfolds across. Because here is something worth knowing before we go any further. The world this family walked through was not one single fixed climate, cold and unchanging, from one century to the next. It was more like something living restless, constantly rearranging itself around them, forests advancing and retreating, ice sheets swelling and shrinking, entire ecosystems flipping from one extreme to another, sometimes within a single lifetime. Understanding that shifting unpredictable backdrop changes how we should picture almost everything we've discussed tonight so far. It is one thing to imagine a family patiently walking a river corridor across a stable, predictable landscape. It is something else entirely to imagine that same family navigating a world where the rules themselves kept quietly changing beneath their feet, where a valley that fed you generously one decade might turn hostile and barren the next purely because of forces completely beyond anyone's control or understanding. That is precisely where we are headed next. Here is something that might completely rearrange how you picture this entire story, so let's start right there. Shut your eyes for a second if you're comfortable doing that while still listening and picture Ice Age Europe. Go ahead, build the image in your mind. I am willing to bet you pictured endless white snow, howling storms, a landscape locked permanently under ice from one horizon to the other. That is almost certainly the picture most of us grew up with thanks to documentaries, museum displays, and 100 dramatic movie posters featuring shivering cavemen huddled against an endless frozen wasteland. Now let me tell you something that will probably surprise you. Not that long before our family settled into their small stone shelter, the exact same patch of the planet was in some ways warmer than the world you and I are living in right now. I promise I am not exaggerating for effect here. Somewhere between roughly 130,000 and 115,000 years ago, the Earth passed through a stretch of climate history scientists now call the last interglacial, a remarkably warm chapter tucked in between two much colder ages. During that window, average temperatures across parts of Europe ran noticeably warmer than they do today, warm enough that hippopotamuses were wading through the River Thames in what is now London, and elephants wandered freely across the English countryside. Excavators working beneath Trafalgar Square right in the heart of modern London have actually pulled up the bones to prove it. The warmth reached far beyond just southern England too. Forests of hazel and oak pushed northward into territory that sits well above the Arctic Circle, today land that has been treeless tundra for the entire span of recorded human history. Sea levels sat several meters higher than they do right now, high enough to swallow low-lying coastal regions that millions of people currently call home. For a brief stretch of geological time, roughly 15,000 years, this planet ran warmer, wetter, and considerably greener across its northern reaches than the world any of us has ever personally experienced. Sit with that image for a moment, because I think it completely upends the tired old picture most of us carry around in our heads. Somewhere underneath one of the busiest, most iconic public squares in the world, in a spot now surrounded by traffic tourists and pigeons, there are the fossilized remains of hippos that once floated lazily through a warm British river. If that does not rearrange your mental picture of ancient Europe at least a little, I am not sure what will. Now, why does any of this actually matter to the family we've been following tonight? You might be wondering honestly how anyone can claim to know what the weather was like more than 100,000 years before thermometers, weather stations, or a single written record existed anywhere on the planet. It is a fair question, and the answer involves some remarkably clever detective work. Scientists reconstruct ancient temperatures by studying tiny air bubbles trapped inside ice cores drilled deep into places like Greenland and Antarctica, essentially frozen samples of the actual atmosphere from tens of thousands of years ago. They study fossilized pollen grains preserved in ancient lake beds, since different plants thrive in different climates, and a lake bed full of oak and hazel pollen tells a very different story than one full of pollen from tundra grasses. They study the chemistry locked inside ocean sediment and cave formations. None of it involves guesswork dressed up as certainty. It is a slow, patient accumulation of physical evidence, cross-checked again and again until a reliable picture starts to emerge. Because the world our mother and her two children grew up in was not simply cold. It was a world still carrying the fading echo of that earlier warmth, gradually unevenly tipping towards something colder, decade by decade, generation by generation. The scientific dating for these particular individuals places them somewhere within that broad transitional stretch. Likely, sometime after the warmest peak had already passed, but still well before the truly brutal depths of the Ice Age that would eventually follow. In other words, this family lived through change itself, not through one single fixed climate, but through an entire unstable shifting hinge point in the Earth's long climatic history. I find that detail almost unbearably poignant, if I am honest with you. Picture an elderly member of that extended family, someone who might have heard stories passed down carefully from their own grandparents about warmer winters, gentler springs, rivers that rarely froze solid the way they apparently did now. Meanwhile, the children growing up beside that same fire had only ever known a noticeably colder, harder version of that same landscape. 2 generations, 1 family, 2 entirely different versions of what normal weather even meant. Have you ever had a conversation with an older relative who described a version of the world that felt almost unrecognizable to you? A summer that used to be milder, a winter that used to arrive later, a landscape that has quietly shifted over the course of just 1 lifetime. If so, you already understand on some small personal level exactly what this family may have been experiencing, just stretched across an almost unimaginably longer span of time. What do you imagine that grandmother figure might have told her? Grandchildren gathered near beside the very same kind of fire we pictured together earlier tonight. Perhaps stories that sounded to young ears almost like fairy tales, rivers that never fully froze, summers so generous that food seemed to simply present itself. Whether the children fully believed her, or quietly assumed she was exaggerating the way grandchildren occasionally do with any older relatives' stories, we will obviously never know. But the pattern of believing, doubting, and eventually understanding an elder's version of a changed world feels remarkably familiar, does it not, even across a gap of 100,000 years? Here is where the physical evidence really starts speaking for itself. Remember that small narrow cave we spent so much time exploring earlier tonight, with its uneven floor built up in layer after layer of ancient sediment. Those layers are not simply dirt. They function almost like pages in a very slow, very patient diary, each one recording a snapshot of the world outside during the exact stretch of time it was deposited. Think about that for a moment the way you might think about the rings inside a very old tree, except instead of counting outward from the center, you're reading downward deeper layers, representing older chapters, each one holding on to whatever small fragments of evidence happen to settle there and never fully break down. Pollen grains, tiny fragments of bone, traces of charcoal from long extinguished fires. All of it quietly accumulating one thin layer at a time across a length of time so vast that a single human lifetime barely registers as a visible line within it. In the older, deeper layers, researchers studying the site found a mix of animal remains reflecting a milder, more temperate environment. But moving upward through those layers nearer to the more recent past, the picture shifts noticeably. The bones start belonging to different animals entirely: reindeer, steppe, bison, woolly mammoth. Exactly the kind of hardy, cold, adapted species built for a landscape of biting cold air and short, difficult summers. You can quite literally trace an entire climate transition simply by following which animal bones show up as you dig deeper or shallower through that cave floor. I want you to think about what that actually means for the people living through it in real time, though not just as an interesting scientific footnote. It means the herds this family depended on for food were themselves shifting generation after generation. The plants edible one particular decade might vanish entirely the next, replaced by tougher, hardier growth suited to a colder world. Hunting strategies that worked perfectly well for an older relative might become dangerously unreliable for their own grandchildren, forcing constant quiet adjustment year after year, without any of it ever being written down or explained in a single neat lesson. Consider something as simple as knowing where to wait for a herd of deer during migration season. In a milder climate, deer might follow one particular path along a valley floor drawn by softer ground and abundant vegetation. As the region cooled and that valley floor grew harder frozen for longer stretches of the year, those same deer might shift their route entirely favouring a different slope, a different water source, a different rhythm altogether. A hunter who kept faithfully returning to the old familiar waiting spot, the one that had fed their family reliably for years, might find themselves waiting beside an empty trail, while their family grew hungrier by the day. Survival meant staying curious enough and humble enough to notice when an old certainty had quietly become a liability. This is exactly where I think the tired old caveman stereotype falls apart completely. For a long time, popular imagination pictured these people as simple, static creatures, locked into one unchanging way of life, hunting the same animals with the same tools in the same frozen landscape forever. The actual evidence tells a completely different story. This was a species, and specifically this one small family, constantly renegotiating its relationship with an unpredictable shifting world, adjusting, recalibrating, learning to interpret new patterns as the old ones quietly stopped applying. If anything, I think that makes their survival considerably more impressive, not less. It is one thing to master a single unchanging environment and simply repeat that mastery indefinitely. It is something else entirely to remain successful while the actual rules of survival keep gradually rewriting themselves underneath you, generation after generation, with absolutely no warning system beyond careful observation and hard-earned memory. I think about this in terms of my own family sometimes, and I suspect you might too once you sit with it. Somewhere back a few generations, someone in your family tree almost certainly lived through their own version of a shifting world, a war that rearranged an entire country, a depression that emptied out savings accounts overnight, a migration across an ocean toward a language they did not yet speak. None of them had the luxury of mastering one stable set of circumstances and coasting on that mastery forever. They adjusted because the alternative was simply not surviving the adjustment at all. In that very specific sense, you are already the living proof of exactly the kind of resilience we are discussing tonight, just measured across centuries instead of tens of thousands of years. Scientists who study this particular period sometimes describe a pattern worth mentioning here, because it applies directly to our family's own story. As conditions turned colder across the wider region, Neanderthal populations in areas like this one appear to have shrunk, sometimes even disappearing from certain regions almost entirely, for a stretch of time, only to return again once conditions eased back towards something more livable. Not a single permanent decline, more like breathing expansion and contraction retreat, and return repeated across tens of thousands of years as the climate itself swung back and forth long before anything resembling the true depths of the Ice Age finally arrived, which for the record would not properly end until somewhere around 11,000 years ago. That pattern of retreat and return tells me something quietly remarkable about this particular family line. No matter how harsh conditions became during certain stretches, this specific maternal thread, the one connecting our mother and her two children back to ancestors scattered clear across an entire continent, managed to persist. Not by refusing to bend, by bending repeatedly exactly when bending was required, and then holding steady again once the world settled back into something more forgiving. I keep coming back to a particular thought while researching this part of the story, and I want to share it with you honestly. We tend to associate toughness with rigidity, gritting your teeth, refusing to change, powering straight through no matter what stands in your way. But everything this family's history actually demonstrates points toward a completely different kind of strength. Flexibility. The willingness to notice when the old approach has quietly stopped working, and the humility to adjust before it costs you everything. Does that not sound remarkably familiar in its own strange way? I do not think I need to draw too heavy a line between an ancient family adapting to a shifting Ice Age landscape, and any of us adapting to the shifting realities of our own lives' careers that change shape overnight. Familiar routines suddenly upended entire industries, reshaping themselves within the span of a single working lifetime. The specific challenges look nothing alike. The underlying skill required to survive them might not be quite as different as we would like to assume. Here is a small lighter thought before we move forward, because I think it deserves a moment of genuine appreciation. This family navigated a slow-motion climate shift stretching across thousands of years with absolutely no weather forecast, no seasonal outlook, no early warning of any kind beyond patient observation, passed down from one generation to the next. Meanwhile, plenty of us still managed to get caught completely off guard by a sudden afternoon rainstorm, despite carrying a phone capable of predicting it nearly to the minute. I think that puts things into fairly humbling perspective. So here is where all of this leaves us. A family shaped not by one single stable environment, but by change itself arriving slowly unevenly, generation after generation, forcing constant quiet adjustment, simply to keep surviving. Warmth fading into cold. Familiar herds replaced by unfamiliar ones. An entire ecosystem rewriting itself gradually enough that no single lifetime could ever fully capture the whole transformation, yet fast enough that the mother we met earlier tonight was almost certainly navigating a noticeably harder world than the one her own grandmother once knew. Think about everything that particular kind of resilience actually demands from a family. It demands memory, someone willing to remember exactly how the previous cold spell was survived. It demands teaching someone patient enough to pass those hard-earned lessons down before it was too late. And it demands a certain quiet, stubborn hope, the willingness to keep raising children, keep planning for another season, keep believing the effort was worthwhile, even while the ground beneath your feet kept shifting in ways no single person could fully predict or control. But surviving that kind of shifting, unpredictable world required more than simply noticing the changes happening around them. It required tools sharp enough, precise enough, cleverly designed enough to actually do something about it. Recognizing that a herd had moved or that a familiar plant had disappeared only gets a family so far if they cannot also adapt the physical means of turning that knowledge into food, warmth, and safety. Awareness without capability is simply a slower, more frustrating way of running out of options. And that is exactly the part of this story I want to walk you through next, because the small scattered stone flakes this family left, scattered around their fire, turn out to be far more sophisticated than most people would ever expect, a quiet, unglamorous technology that may have mattered just as much to this family's survival as any single decision about which valley to walk toward next. Alright, let's actually look closely at what this family was carrying around with them, because I think you are going to be surprised. When most of us picture a stone tool, we picture something crude, a rough rock with a jagged edge barely distinguishable from any other broken piece of gravel lying beside a riverbank. Functional maybe in the loosest possible sense. Not something you would call clever. Certainly not something you would call designed. Now let me show you what was actually sitting on that cave floor. Archaeologists studying this family's toolkit, along with dozens of similar sites scattered across a huge stretch of territory, gave this particular style of toolmaking a specific name drawn from a rock shelter in central France called la micoque, where the very first examples of this technique were properly identified and described more than a century ago. The name stuck, and researchers now use it to describe an entire shared tradition, stretching across thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years, one unified thread of technical knowledge running through dozens of separate communities who in most cases never met each other and had no possible way of knowing the others even existed. But the tool itself, the real star of the collection, carries a far more descriptive nickname among researchers who study it, closely borrowed from the German language, roughly translating to wedge knife. Here is what made this particular design so clever. One edge of the tool was worked down into a razor-sharp, precise cutting surface, capable of slicing through hide, tendon and meat with real efficiency. But the opposite edge, the back of the blade, was left deliberately thick, blunt and rounded. Not from carelessness. On purpose. Think about why that matters for a second. If you have ever tried using a plain, uniformly sharp blade for any length of time, you already know the problem. Your palm eventually protests. Cutting for an extended stretch with a tool sharpened evenly along its entire edge means constantly fighting against your own grip. Unless you happen to be wearing gloves nobody in this story had access to. By deliberately leaving one entire side of the tool blunt, this family and countless generations of their relatives across an enormous stretch of Europe effectively built a handle directly into the stone itself. You could press your palm firmly against that thick, dull spine, applying real pressure, real control, without slicing open your own hand in the process. It is the exact same basic engineering logic behind the spine of a modern kitchen knife. The flat, blunt top edge you rest your thumb against while chopping vegetables. Somebody figured out that same fundamental principle through nothing but careful observation and patient trial and error roughly 100,000 years before anyone had ever heard the word ergonomics. Does that sound like the work of a simple instinct-driven creature to you? I have to be honest, it does not sound that way to me at all. There is something else worth mentioning here, something a little harder to prove with hard numbers, but fascinating all the same. Researchers who have spent years studying the finished shape of these blades have noticed a curious pattern. The final form is often more symmetrical, more carefully balanced, more visually consistent than pure function alone would strictly require. A blade only slightly less refined would likely have cut just as effectively. Some researchers who study this pattern closely have suggested these toolmakers may have been working from something resembling an aesthetic ideal in their own minds, a specific mental picture of what a properly finished blade was supposed to look like, refined and pursued for its own sake above and beyond the bare minimum required for the tool to simply function. I find that idea quietly thrilling, honestly. It suggests these were not people grinding out the bare minimum needed to survive another day. There may have been something bordering on craftsmanship pride buried inside this entire process, the same quiet satisfaction you might feel completing any difficult, skillful task exactly right rather than merely adequately. Here is a detail I find even more compelling, though, because it challenges a much deeper assumption most of us carry around without even realizing it. We tend to imagine ancient tools as essentially disposable, picked up, used once or twice, tossed aside the moment they grew slightly dull, replaced without a second thought. Researchers who have studied these particular blades, closely examining the wear patterns and the subtle scars left behind from repeated use, discovered something rather different. These tools were not thrown away after a single use. They were maintained, resharpened, carried forward sometimes across what appears to be a remarkably long working life, renewed again and again as the edge gradually wore down. There is even a specific, carefully documented method researchers have identified for how this resharpening was done, a technique that involves striking off a long, precise flake down the length of the blade to restore a clean, sharp edge without sacrificing the tool's overall shape. And here is a small detail that gave me an unexpected chill the first time I came across it. That particular resharpening method is named by the researchers who first identified it after a river valley near Krakow tucked into the very same limestone upland where this family made their home. It is entirely possible this specific family or their nearest neighbours either helped originate that exact technique or learned it from someone who lived practically around the corner from them, geologically speaking. I want you to picture that for a moment. Somewhere in that narrow little cave, someone sat patiently beside the fire, working a worn blade back into shape, using a precise practice sequence of strikes they did not invent from scratch in that exact moment. They had been taught. Someone before them had sat in roughly the same position, teaching hands, guiding younger hands, correcting a poorly aimed strike, demonstrating the correct angle over and over until the motion became second nature. That is not guesswork on my part either. Researchers studying similar toolkits from a nearby site in Germany specifically looked at subtle strike patterns left behind on unfinished tools, evidence of which hand a toolmaker favoured evidence of hesitant corrected strikes, typical of someone still learning the craft sitting alongside more confident practice strikes from someone who clearly already knew exactly what they were doing. In other words, actual physical evidence of teaching taking place, an experienced adult guiding a less experienced apprentice captured permanently in stone. Picture the scene for a moment, because I think it deserves a little more attention than a single passing mention. An adult sits with a partly finished blade striking a flake away, with a single clean confident motion, the kind of motion that only comes after thousands of repetitions. Beside them, a child or perhaps a younger relative still building that same confidence attempts the same strike, misjudges the angle slightly, and produces a flake that veers off in the wrong direction, wasting a portion of otherwise usable stone. The adult does not discard the lesson in frustration. They correct the grip, adjust the angle, demonstrate again patiently, the same way any skilled parent today might guide a child's hand while teaching them to use scissors properly for the very first time, correcting the same small mistake 3, 4, 5 times before it finally clicks. Most of those toolmakers, by the way, appear to have strongly favoured their right hand, the same overwhelming right-handed tendency you find across nearly all modern human populations today. It is a small, almost throwaway detail in most academic papers, but I find it quietly remarkable. The particular wiring inside our brains that makes most of us reach for a pen with our right hand was apparently already firmly in place in this family and in their wider community over 100,000 years ago. Let's talk about what this entire toolmaking tradition actually required, because I think it is easy to underestimate just how much thinking went into producing a single finished blade. The process did not begin with a lucky strike of stone against stone. It began with selecting exactly the right raw material, a particular type of flint, with the correct internal structure to fracture predictably, rather than crumbling apart into useless fragments. Not just any stone lying conveniently underfoot would do the job. Good workable flint of the right quality was not always available in the immediate area surrounding a campsite, which means this family and communities very much like them sometimes had to travel deliberately toward known sources carrying good raw material back with them across real distances rather than simply making do with whatever happened to be nearby. That alone tells you something. Nobody plans a supply run for a specific material unless they already understand quite clearly the difference between a good tool and a mediocre one. From there, the maker had to remove a careful, deliberate sequence of preparatory flakes shaping the emerging tool step by step, always thinking 2 or 3 strikes ahead because a single poorly placed blow could ruin hours of careful work in an instant. Researchers who study these production sequences closely describe them as remarkably standardized, meaning toolmakers across huge distances separated by hundreds of miles and multiple generations were following essentially the same structured set of steps, the same mental blueprint to arrive at essentially the same final design. Think of it almost like a family recipe passed down carefully enough, precisely enough, that a dish made by a grandmother in one kitchen tastes recognizably similar to the same dish made decades later by a grandchild in an entirely different kitchen hundreds of miles away. The ingredients might vary slightly depending on what was locally available, but the underlying method, the sequence, the technique stayed remarkably consistent. Have you ever tried teaching someone a truly difficult physical skill, something like a specific knife cut in the kitchen, or a particular knot that has to be tied exactly right? If you have, you already understand instinctively just how much patience, repetition, and careful correction that kind of teaching actually demands. Now imagine passing that exact same kind of hands-on skill down faithfully enough generation after generation that the fundamental technique survived, essentially unchanged for more than 50,000 years across a stretch of territory reaching from Western Germany through Poland into the mountains of Crimea and all the way into the northern Caucasus. 50,000 years is not a phrase that always lands with its full weight the first time you hear it, so let me try putting it another way. If you lined up every single generation involved in keeping that one specific teaching tradition alive, grandparent to parent, parent to child over and over without a single broken link, you would need somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 consecutive successful handoffs. 2,000 separate moments where an adult sat down with a child and made absolutely certain the knowledge did not die out with them. Not one of those handoffs was guaranteed. Every single one required someone choosing deliberately to take the time. That last detail is not a coincidence either, and I think it connects beautifully to something we uncovered earlier tonight. Remember that widely scattered genetic thread, the one connecting our mother and her children here in Poland to relatives recovered from such enormous distances away. The physical toolkits recovered from those exact same distant regions carry unmistakable technological fingerprints in common, as well the same wedge knife design, the same careful resharpening technique, the same underlying manufacturing logic. Genetics tells us this family's bloodline stretched across a continent. Their toolkit tells us their knowledge stretched every bit as far alongside it. Two completely independent lines of evidence arriving at essentially the same remarkable conclusion. I find something quietly moving in that overlap, honestly. It means the connections between these distant, scattered communities were not simply biological accidents of who happened to move where. They were also relationships built on shared skill, shared technique, a common language written not in words but in the careful practice strike of stone against stone. Here is a small lighter thought before we move any further, because I think it deserves a moment of genuine appreciation, especially compared to how most of us treat our own everyday tools. A single one of these knives may have been resharpened, carried and relied upon for years, quite possibly for an entire working lifetime, patiently maintained rather than casually replaced. Meanwhile, plenty of us today lose count of how many cheap kitchen knives, phone chargers or umbrellas we have gone through in just the past 12 months alone. I do not know about you, but there is something almost humbling about a species we once dismissed as primitive, apparently having a considerably healthier relationship with their own possessions than a fair number of us manage today. There is a deeper point buried in all of this too, one I think is worth sitting with for a moment. A tool this carefully designed, this patiently maintained, this deliberately taught to the next generation was clearly valued as more than a disposable object. It represented invested time, invested skill, and quite possibly genuine pride in a job done well. That particular blend of practicality and craftsmanship function, fused together with something bordering on care, feels remarkably, unmistakably human to me, not merely useful, cared for. So think back one more time to that mother and her 2 children gathered beside their fire in that narrow little cave. The blade resting near that fire was not simply a rock somebody happened to pick up that morning. It carried quite literally in its exact shape and precise edge the accumulated teaching of countless hands that came before hers, patiently passed down one careful correction at a time until it finally reached her own. Consider for a moment everything that single object actually represents once you add it all up. Someone had to travel to find the right stone. Someone had to teach the correct sequence of strikes patiently, more than once tolerating every clumsy early attempt along the way. Someone had to demonstrate and later approve of a specific finished shape, considered properly satisfyingly correct, not merely functional. And someone later still had to sit beside that same fire resharpening that exact blade rather than simply discarding it, because it had already proven itself worth keeping. An entire quiet history of patience, trust and care, condensed into one small, unremarkable-looking piece of stone. And that raises a question worth sitting with as we move forward tonight. If this much care, this much patient teaching went into something as ordinary as a knife, what does that suggest about how this family treated each other? The actual relationships, the bonds of trust and obligation that made this kind of careful generational teaching possible in the first place. Because passing down a skill this precisely generation after generation requires something far more fundamental than clever hands. It requires people who truly cared enough about each other to teach, to correct, to be patient through every clumsy failed attempt along the way. That particular thread, the emotional architecture holding this entire family together, is exactly where we are headed next. So let's follow that thread all the way through, because I think what we find at the end of it might be one of the most moving pieces of evidence in this entire story. Thousands of miles from the small cave we've spent tonight exploring, tucked into the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq, there is another cave that gave archaeologists one of the clearest windows we have into how Neanderthals actually treated each other, not as a small family of 3, but as an entire community, caring for one particularly vulnerable member. That cave sits on the slope of a mountain overlooking a river valley, first excavated back in the 1950s by an American archaeologist and his team. Over the following years, they would recover the remains of 10 separate Neanderthals from those sediments, men, women and infants, along with enough physical evidence to spark one of the longest-running debates in the entire field of human origins, a debate about just how emotionally complex these people actually were. The remains belong to a man researchers now call simply by the number assigned to him decades ago. He lived somewhere around 50,000 years ago, and by the time he died, sometime in his 40s, his body told an almost unbelievable story of survival. Early in life, he suffered a violent, crushing blow to the side of his head, severe enough to have likely blinded him permanently in one eye. That same injury appears to have damaged the area of the brain controlling movement on the opposite side of his body, leaving one entire arm withered, weakened and largely useless for the rest of his life. At some point, that damaged arm was either amputated or simply wasted away entirely below the elbow. His leg carried old healed fractures of its own, likely leaving him with a pronounced limp. And as if all of that were not enough, later analysis of his skull revealed extensive bony growths inside both ear canals, the kind that would have left him profoundly, almost completely deaf. Sit with that combination for a moment. Blind in one eye, missing most of one arm, a damaged leg, and on top of everything else unable to properly hear a warning shout, an approaching predator, or another person's voice calling out beside him. Now here is the detail that stops researchers in their tracks every single time this case comes up. Every one of those injuries had fully healed by the time he died, years, likely even decades before his actual death. Which means this man did not simply survive his injuries. He lived with them, functioning in some meaningful capacity for a considerable stretch of his adult life afterward. Ask yourself something honestly for a moment. How does a partially blind, mostly one-armed, profoundly deaf hunter-gatherer survive for years in an environment full of large predators, unpredictable terrain, and constant physical demand, all without the benefit of modern medicine, modern accommodations, or a single convenience any of us take for granted? He could not have hunted effectively. He likely struggled to travel any real distance on his own. He would not have heard danger approaching from almost any direction. One researcher who studied this particular case in detail, an anthropology professor working out of Washington University, made a point that has stuck with me ever since I came across it. He argued that the hearing loss alone, layered on top of everything else, would have made this man extraordinarily easy prey for the predators that shared his landscape, and that his survival almost certainly depended on other members of his community looking out for him. Losing a hand, losing an eye, even losing the ability to walk. Normally a person might still compensate for on their own to some degree. Losing your hearing entirely in a world without walls, without locked doors, where every predator announces itself first through sound rather than sight, is a different category of vulnerable altogether. There is really only one honest explanation that fits the evidence. Other people carried him in every sense that phrase can mean. They must have shared food with him that he could not have gathered himself. They must have kept watch on his behalf, warned him of dangers he could neither see nor hear coming. Someone, likely several someones, made the ongoing, unglamorous, exhausting choice to keep this particular man alive for years, with absolutely nothing to gain from it in any purely practical survival-driven sense. I want to pause on that last part because I think it matters enormously. A purely cold, transactional view of survival would predict exactly the opposite outcome here. A group focused solely on efficient survival should have left a member this severely disabled behind long before his injuries ever had the chance to heal. The fact that his bones healed at all that he lived on for years afterward tells us something his community valued him for reasons that went well beyond what he could physically contribute. Whatever that reason actually was, memory, companionship, wisdom, simple attachment, something clearly outweighed the practical burden of keeping him alive. Now, I do want to be honest with you about something because I think intellectual honesty matters more than a tidy feel-good story. Not every researcher agrees on exactly how much emotional weight to place on evidence like this. Some scholars have pushed back gently against the more sentimental interpretations, pointing out that survival alone does not automatically prove deep compassion in the way we understand it today. It is possible, they argue, that a group simply tolerated his presence without any particularly warm feeling attached to the arrangement at all. Science tends to be appropriately cautious about reading too much modern emotion directly onto ancient bones. This is not a new argument either. Researchers raising these exact same doubts have been part of this conversation since at least the 1980s, questioning whether generosity is really the only explanation available, or whether we are simply projecting our own values backward onto people who cannot argue back or clarify their actual intentions. It is a fair challenge, and I respect it, because the alternative, accepting every emotionally satisfying interpretation without scrutiny, is exactly how bad history gets made in the first place. But here is where I land on it personally, for whatever that is worth. Tolerance alone does not typically stretch across years of actively sharing scarce food, years of active protection, years of adjusting an entire group's movement and pace to accommodate someone who could not keep up on his own. At a certain point, the sheer duration and consistency of that kind of support starts to look a great deal like care, whatever specific word you want to put on it. A group that simply tolerated him could have just as easily left him behind the very first time his condition became inconvenient. They did not. Repeatedly across years, they apparently chose otherwise. Here is a related story I think you deserve to hear in full, partly because it is fascinating, and partly because I think it teaches an important lesson about how careful we all need to be with beautiful narratives, myself very much included. For decades, another burial from that exact same cave was celebrated as one of the most touching discoveries in the entire field. Researchers examining the soil beneath one particular skeleton found unusual clusters of ancient pollen, and the interpretation that quickly took hold and spread across documentaries, textbooks, and popular articles for 50 years was almost impossibly moving. This man, it was claimed, had been laid to rest on a bed of wildflowers, tucked in with yarrow grape, hyacinth, and other blooms, an image of grief and tenderness stretching back tens of thousands of years. I have to tell you, more recent research has significantly complicated that particular story, and I think it is important I share that with you, honestly, rather than simply repeating the prettier version. A team of researchers taking a much more careful look at the sediment and the local wildlife found strong evidence pointing toward a considerably less poetic explanation. A small local rodent known for collecting and storing flowers inside its burrows appears to have been active in that exact same cave. The pollen clusters may well have come from burrowing rodent activity rather than a deliberate funeral tribute at all. I will admit, when I first learned of that correction, it stung a little. That flower burial image had lodged itself somewhere sentimental in my own head years ago, and watching careful, honest science quietly walk it back felt almost like losing something. But I think that discomfort is actually the entire point and exactly why I wanted to share it with you, rather than simply skip past it. Good history done properly is not about protecting the version of the past that makes us feel the most emotional. It is about following the evidence honestly, even when doing so costs you your favourite detail. The flowers may not have been placed there deliberately. But here is what still does hold up even after all that careful scrutiny. This man and several others recovered from that same cave were still deliberately, carefully buried their bodies, placed with clear intention, rather than simply abandoned wherever they happened to fall. That underlying fact, the intentional repeated act of burial itself, has survived decades of tough scientific re-examination. The flowers turned out to be a beautiful embellishment we should let go of. The care itself did not. I think there is something worth learning from that distinction honestly, well beyond the specific details of one ancient burial. Sometimes the true version of a story ends up slightly less sweeping, less cinematic than the version we first fell in love with, and the honest thing to do is accept the correction gracefully rather than cling to the prettier lie simply because it felt nicer to believe. So let's bring this back around to our own family, the mother, the boy, the girl gathered around their fire in that narrow Polish cave, because I think this wider evidence changes how we should picture their world just a little. We already know this particular mother invested years of sustained care into two children of noticeably different ages. That alone tells us something meaningful about her, about the kind of patient, ongoing attention she was clearly capable of. But the wider pattern we've just walked through suggests that kind of care was not some rare isolated exception, limited strictly to parents and their own children. It appears to have extended outward to the injured, to the elderly, to anyone whose usefulness to the group had technically declined but whose place within that group had not. Think about who else might have been sitting somewhere just beyond the edge of that firelight out of view, but still very much part of the family's world. An older relative whose hunting days had long since ended kept fed anyway. someone recovering from an old injury given lighter work rather than being pushed back out into danger before they were ready. We tend to picture ancient family life as a tight, narrow circle of exactly the people we can see clearly in the historical record. The evidence tonight suggests that circle was almost certainly wider, warmer, and considerably more forgiving than the record alone lets us witness directly. Have you ever found yourself caring for someone, a parent, a grandparent, a dear friend, well past the point where it made any practical sense at all, purely because the relationship itself mattered more to you than the practical math involved? If so, you already understand on a deeply personal level exactly the kind of quiet, exhausting devotion this ancient evidence is asking us to imagine, just extended across an entire tiny community, sustained for years, with none of the medicine, technology, or convenience any of us rely on today. I keep thinking about how differently we tend to talk about caregiving now, honestly. We discuss insurance coverage, staffing shortages, the exhausting logistics of managing a loved one's ongoing needs, and all of that conversation is completely valid and important. But underneath all of that modern complexity sits the exact same fundamental question a small group of Neanderthals apparently answered quietly, without any framework or vocabulary for it at all, tens of thousands of years before anyone thought to write any of it down. Do we keep this person even when keeping them costs us something real? Their answer, based on everything the bones are telling us, seems to have been a fairly resounding yes. What would it have actually cost this particular community in practical terms to keep that injured man alive for years? Fewer hands available for a hunt, a slower overall pace when the group needed to move quickly, extra food shared out of an already limited supply food that could have gone toward a child or a pregnant woman or anyone considered a safer investment in purely practical terms. None of that math works out favourably if survival alone is the only value being weighed, and yet year after year apparently they kept choosing him anyway. There is a small lighter thought I want to leave you with before we move on, because I think it deserves a moment of appreciation too. Somewhere in that wider Neanderthal world, a badly injured, mostly blind, completely deaf man managed to live for years, surrounded by people willing to look out for him, with absolutely no modern hospital, no wheelchair, no hearing aid, nothing beyond the patience and attention of the people around him. Meanwhile, plenty of us today struggle to remember to check in on an elderly neighbour, despite carrying a phone specifically designed to remind us. I think that puts things into fairly humbling perspective one more time tonight, but here is a question worth sitting with as we move forward. Was this pattern of care and belonging something every single Neanderthal community shared equally everywhere, across every population scattered across that enormous continent we've been tracing tonight? I wish I could tell you the answer was a simple, comforting yes. History rarely cooperates that neatly, though, and I promised you honesty over comfort tonight, not the other way around. Different groups living in different places under different pressures, at different points across tens of thousands of years, did not all necessarily write the same gentle chapter our Stajnia family and their Iraqi neighbours appear to have written. Some communities, when circumstances turned desperate enough, left behind an entirely different kind of evidence considerably harder to sit with, evidence that complicates any simple universal claim about who these people fundamentally were. I think you deserve to hear that harder story too honestly, not because it should overshadow everything gentle we have uncovered tonight, but because a complete truthful portrait of any people, ancient or otherwise, has to include its darker chapters alongside its tender ones. Real families, real communities, real history rarely offer us the comfort of a single tidy moral running cleanly from beginning to end. And the next family whose bones survived long enough for us to study closely tells a story considerably more complicated than the one we've spent tonight following. That harder story takes us far from Poland all the way to the northern coast of Spain to a cave system carved into the hills of a region called Asturias. In the mid-1990s, cavers exploring a passage stretching more than 2 miles underground stumbled onto something they clearly were not expecting. Bones. A great many of them scattered across the floor of one particular chamber, unmistakably human in shape, but unmistakably ancient in every other way. At first, local authorities suspected something considerably more recent, perhaps victims from the Spanish Civil War, a conflict whose scars still surface unexpectedly across that part of the country even today. It did not take investigators long to realize they were looking at something else entirely. Something that had been resting undisturbed in that particular chamber for tens of thousands of years. What researchers eventually pieced together from that chamber turned into one of the most detailed, most thoroughly studied Neanderthal discoveries anywhere on the planet. At least 13 individuals, 7 adults, 3 teenagers, 2 younger children, and 1 infant, all recovered from that same small stretch of cave, all dated to somewhere around 49,000 years ago. If that number sounds familiar, it should. It is nearly double the size of the family we've spent this entire evening following. And just like our own small group back in Poland, genetic testing eventually confirmed that these 13 people were not simply unrelated strangers who happened to end up in the same cave. They were in the truest possible sense a family, a clan. I want you to notice something right away though, because this is exactly where our 2 stories begin quietly pulling apart from one another. Remember how our Stajnia family's story unfolded. A widely travelled maternal thread, one specific genetic signature passed faithfully from mother to child, turning up scattered across an entire continent from Poland to Spain to the Caucasus. The picture that painted was one of mobility of daughters moving outward generation after generation, carrying that same thread further and further from home. This Spanish family tells the mirror opposite version of that story. When researchers studied the genetic patterns among these 13 individuals more closely, they found something almost inverted compared to what we uncovered in Poland. The men in this particular group showed remarkably little genetic variation between them, generation after generation of closely related males apparently staying rooted in the exact same territory their whole lives. The women, by contrast, showed considerably more genetic diversity, suggesting they were the ones arriving from elsewhere, joining this specific community from outside rather than being born into it. In plain terms, this looks like the exact reverse arrangement from what we found in our own family. Here it appears the sons stayed home generation after generation, while daughters and young wives were the ones who travelled, arriving as outsiders to join an already established, deeply rooted group of local men. Think about what daily life inside a community organised that way might have actually felt like, especially for the women who arrived there. Imagine leaving behind every familiar face you'd ever known, every landmark, every childhood memory tied to a specific stretch of territory, to walk into a group of strangers who had known each other and each other's fathers and each other's fathers before them for as long as any of them could remember. That is a very particular kind of quiet courage, arriving alone or nearly alone into a tightly bonded circle you're expected to simply fold yourself into. Meanwhile, back in Poland, our own family's daughters were apparently doing something similar, in reverse, leaving home themselves, carrying their own mother's genetic thread outward into unfamiliar territory. 2 very different versions of the exact same fundamental courage. Isn't that a fascinating thing to sit with for a moment? 2 Neanderthal families, both confirmed through careful genetic work, both existing within the same broad window of prehistory, and yet organising something as fundamental as family life along essentially opposite lines. One community built around women who travelled, another built around women who arrived. If you ever needed proof that referring to an entire species with one single, flattened stereotype misses the point entirely, I think this comparison makes that case better than almost anything else we have covered tonight. There is more to this particular family's story, though, and I want to walk through it carefully because some of it is truly difficult, and I think you deserve both the honesty and the context surrounding it. Living in one tight-rooted community for generation after generation, with relatively few new arrivals beyond the occasional woman marrying in from outside, comes with a real biological cost. Researchers examining the skeletal remains from this cave found a striking number of small inherited physical anomalies scattered throughout the group, subtle variations in the spine, the jaw, the feet. The kind of pattern doctors today would immediately associate with a population that had been repeatedly marrying within a fairly narrow, closely related circle for a long stretch of time. At least 4 separate individuals shared the exact same unusual anomaly in one of the bones at the top of the spine, a pattern extremely unlikely to appear that often by pure chance alone. Researchers documented well over a dozen distinct anomalies scattered across the group in total narrowed nasal passages, unusual bone formations in the neck, small structural quirks in the feet and hands, each one individually unremarkable, but together forming a pattern that becomes hard to explain any other way. When a population has spent long enough drawing from an unusually small, closely related pool of potential partners, these kinds of quiet physical signatures tend to accumulate generation after generation, written directly into the architecture of the skeleton itself. None of this means anyone did anything wrong, by the way. It simply reflects the practical reality facing an isolated community with a remarkably small pool of potential partners available to them. When your world consists of one small-rooted clan generation, after generation options narrow considerably whether anyone intends for that to happen or not. Now here is the part of the story I've been building toward, and I want to handle it with real care because it deserves that. When researchers examined the bones from this cave, closely cut marks and evidence that the skulls had been deliberately broken open, they found signs that some members of this family had at some point been butchered. Not by outsiders as far as anyone can tell, by other members of their own community. I know how that sounds, and I'm not going to pretend it does not sit heavily. But I think it is worth resisting the urge to picture something cruel or predatory happening here, because the far more likely explanation, the one most researchers actually favour, is considerably sadder than that. Extreme sustained starvation, the kind of desperate final resort a community turns to only after every other option has already failed, is the leading interpretation for what happened in that cave. Not violence for its own sake, survival pushed to its absolute most heartbreaking limit. It helps, I think, to understand just how fragile survival could become for a small isolated group like this one. A single failed hunting season, a sudden harsh winter, an injury to one too many able-bodied adults at once, and an entire community's margin for error could collapse within a matter of weeks. There was no stored grain to fall back on, no neighbouring town to appeal to for help, no wider safety net of any kind beyond the small circle of people already struggling alongside you. When that margin finally ran out completely entirely, researchers studying similar cases across the wider historical and anthropological record have documented again and again in circumstances separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles that desperate starving communities have sometimes turned to this same unbearable final option, not out of cruelty, but out of a kind of horrifying practical arithmetic that most of us will never be forced to calculate ourselves. I think it is worth pausing here honestly to consider how easily we judge people from the safety of a warm room, a full refrigerator, and thousands of years of distance. None of us can truly know what impossible choices circumstances might force onto any community facing complete and total starvation, watching children and elders slowly fade in front of them with no other option left on the table. I am not asking you to feel comfortable with what apparently happened in that cave. I am only asking you to hold it with the same complexity real human tragedy actually deserves, rather than flattening it into simple horror and looking away. I want to leave you with something gentler about this same family, though, because 13 people are so much more than the single hardest chapter of their story, and I think they deserve to be remembered for more than that alone. Genetic testing on these same remains uncovered something rather remarkable tucked away amid all that heartbreak. Several individuals carried the same version of a particular gene closely tied to human speech and language, processing the same version carried by virtually everyone alive today. Scientists sometimes describe this particular gene as one small piece of the biological machinery that allows humans to control the fine muscle movements needed for structured speech, the rapid, precise coordination of tongue, lips, and breath required to form actual words rather than simple grunts or gestures. Whatever these people were capable of saying to each other, whatever comfort, warning, or tenderness passed between them in their final difficult season together, the biological hardware for genuine structured language appears to have already been firmly in place. Try to imagine that for a moment. Somewhere inside that cave, in whatever language these people actually spoke to each other, a mother may have quietly reassured a frightened child. Someone may have argued, pleaded, comforted, or grieved out loud using real structured words, the same fundamental biological toolkit sitting inside your own throat and brain right now as you listen to this. That capacity was not something that arrived later exclusively with our own species. It was already there, fully formed inside this family, inside their entire wider community, tens of thousands of years before either of us was born. And there is one more detail I find almost startlingly human. Testing also revealed that at least some members of this family very likely had pale skin and quite possibly red hair, the same recessive genetic combination that still shows up in plenty of families around the world today, including statistically more than a few of you watching this right now. Picture that for a moment. A red-haired Neanderthal child, freckled, pale-skinned, indistinguishable at a glance from a child you might pass on any ordinary street today. That detail undoes something in me every time I sit with it. These were not some alien unrecognizable other. They looked in ways we can now actually prove startlingly like us. They spoke in some real biological sense using the same fundamental equipment we use tonight. And in their final, most desperate season together, they apparently made an unbearable choice that most of us will thankfully never have to imagine making ourselves. So here is where I think this comparison actually lands if we step back and look at both families side by side. Our small family in Poland, gentle, wide, travelling, apparently generous, even toward their most vulnerable members. This much larger family in Spain, rooted insular, ultimately overtaken by circumstances brutal enough to force an unthinkable choice upon them. Both of them entirely, completely Neanderthal. Both of them real. I think this is exactly where so much popular imagination about this species quietly goes wrong, honestly. We tend to want one single tidy verdict. Were Neanderthals gentle or brutal? Were they family-oriented or savage? As though an entire species spread across an entire continent over more than 100,000 years could possibly be summarized in a single adjective. Ask yourself something simple for a moment. Could you fairly summarize all of modern humanity, every culture, every family, every era in one single word? Of course not. Some human communities today are famous for their hospitality and warmth. Others tragically have their own dark chapters written into their history, wars, famines, desperate choices made under desperate circumstances, Neither version cancels out the other. Both are simply honestly part of the same complicated species. Have you ever assumed an entire group of people, an entire culture, an entire era must have all lived roughly the same way, only to discover later just how much variation actually existed underneath that assumption? I think that is precisely the correction this comparison forces on us tonight. There was never one single Neanderthal story. There were countless small, distinct, deeply human stories playing out across an entire continent, some gentle, some devastating, most probably somewhere quietly in between. What strikes me most sitting with both of these families side by side is how much their differences seem to trace back to circumstance rather than character. A cave with reliable access to game and water, in a stretch of country still holding on to the last warmth of a fading interglacial. A cave in a harsher, more isolated pocket of territory, cut off from easy contact with neighbouring groups vulnerable, the moment a single season turned against them. Perhaps the real lesson buried inside both of these stories has less to do with who these people fundamentally were, and more to do with just how much environment, luck and circumstance shape what any family, any community, any species ultimately becomes capable of for better or for worse. And that raises a rather strange question, one I did not expect to be asking you tonight, but one that recent research has forced directly into this conversation. What happens when the genetic thread from one of these ancient families turns up somewhere else entirely, thousands of years later than anyone expected, tangled into a completely different, much more controversial mystery involving a lone individual whose true age scientists are still actively arguing about today? That individual was found nowhere near Poland and nowhere near Spain, either in a cave researchers had been quietly excavating for years. And when his genetic profile finally came back from the laboratory, it did not simply add one more data point to the wider Neanderthal story. It threw the timeline of everything we thought we understood into sudden genuine question, in a way that some of the very same researchers behind our own Stajnia family's discovery ended up directly publicly involved in untangling. Because that particular mystery connects back in a rather unsettling way to the very same maternal lineage we've been following all night. Let's go there now, because this particular mystery truly reshaped what scientists thought they understood about the final chapter of the Neanderthal story. In 2015, a team excavating a rock shelter overlooking the Rhône River in southern France uncovered the remains of an adult male Neanderthal tucked into sediment near the surface, so fragile that researchers have spent the better part of a decade removing him from the ground one single grain of soil at a time. So far they have recovered 31 teeth, a portion of his jaw, and 5 small bones from his hand. The rest of him may still be resting in that hillside waiting. The archaeologist who first spotted those remains had actually been suspicious of something unusual in that particular valley for decades already. Years earlier, studying the stone tools scattered throughout that same rock shelter, he had noticed a strange pattern. Tools that looked distinctly different from what neighbouring Neanderthal communities were making during roughly the same window of time, almost as though whoever lived there had simply never adopted certain newer techniques everyone else nearby had already switched over to. At the time, it was an interesting observation without a clear explanation attached to it. Thorin's genetic results would eventually hand him that explanation decades later in a form far stranger than he likely ever expected. The researchers gave him a nickname, and I have to admit it might be my favourite small detail in this entire story. They called him Thorin, borrowed straight from a certain stubborn proud dwarf king in a very famous fantasy novel, the last of his particular royal line. Whoever chose that name clearly had a sense of humour, and possibly a flair for foreshadowing, because it turned out to be a remarkably fitting choice, based purely on where his remains sat within the layered sediment of that rock shelter archaeologists initially placed Thorin somewhere between 40 and 45,000 years old, making him one of the very last Neanderthals to have ever lived on this earth before the species disappeared entirely. A reasonable, fairly ordinary estimate, at least at first glance. Then the genetic results came back and everything got considerably stranger. When researchers sequenced Thorin's genetic material and compared it against other known Neanderthal genomes, his profile did not match what a Neanderthal from 45,000 years ago should have looked like at all. Instead, his genetic signature closely resembled Neanderthals, who had lived more than 100,000 years earlier, an entire different geological era. It was quite literally as though his body belonged to one moment in time, while his genetic blueprint insisted he belonged to another moment entirely separated by tens of thousands of years. Try to imagine how confusing that must have been for the team studying him. Picture opening a family photo album and finding a picture clearly taken with a modern digital camera. Sharp, high-resolution, unmistakably recent, except everyone in the photograph is dressed head to toe in clothing from a century ago. Something about that picture would not add up, and you would immediately start hunting for an explanation, because two contradictory truths cannot both simply be accepted at face value. Here is the explanation researchers eventually landed on, and it is one of the more remarkable ideas in this entire field. Thorin's lineage, they determined, had split away from the wider Neanderthal population somewhere around 105,000 years ago, and from that point forward for an almost unbroken stretch of 50,000 years, his ancestors appear to have had essentially no genetic contact with any other Neanderthal group whatsoever. No mixing, no shared children, no exchange of any kind. A population effectively sealed off from the rest of its own species for an almost unimaginable length of time, which is exactly why his genetic material looked so much older than his physical bones actually were. His genes had simply stopped changing at the same pace as everyone else's, frozen in place by isolation, rather than by time itself. His teeth carried a small, quiet clue pointing toward exactly this kind of isolation too. Researchers examining his jaw noticed an unusual dental feature, an extra pair of molars beyond what a typical Neanderthal mouth would normally contain a trait that tends to show up more frequently in populations that have been drawing from an unusually narrow, closely related gene pool for a long stretch of time. It is a small physical echo of the exact same story. His broader genetic signature was already telling a community that had quite literally been left to its own devices for far too long. And Thorin's community was not the only surprise buried in this particular research. The same analysis turned up faint genetic traces suggesting a third entirely separate Neanderthal population may have also existed somewhere in Europe, during that same general period, a population researchers have not yet been able to properly identify or locate. A ghost lineage essentially visible only as a faint statistical echo inside other people's genetic material, with no bones, no cave, no name of its own. At least not yet. Here is the detail that truly stops me every time I sit with it, though, and I think it deserves a moment of real attention. Researchers studying this case determined that another entirely separate Neanderthal population was living only about 10 days' walk away from Thorin's own community during that exact same window of time. 10 days, not an ocean apart, not separated by some impassable mountain range or frozen wasteland. Near enough that a determined group of travellers, the kind we've already talked about tonight, the kind capable of crossing an entire continent over patient generations, could easily have covered that distance. And yet, as far as the genetic evidence can tell us, these two neighbouring populations spent 50,000 years living within reasonably near distance of each other, while behaving in every meaningful sense as complete and total strangers. Sit with that for a moment, because I think it says something quietly profound. about how differently these two particular communities must have understood their own place in the world. If two modern human populations lived 10 days' walk apart for even a single generation, let alone 50,000 years, it is almost impossible to imagine them never once crossing paths, trading, intermarrying, fighting, borrowing ideas from one another, doing any of the countless things neighbouring human societies have always done throughout recorded history. We are as a species almost pathologically social, constantly reaching outward toward anyone within reach. Whatever kept these two Neanderthal populations so thoroughly, so permanently apart, it reflects a kind of social boundary that looks nothing like our own instincts at all. I do not think that necessarily means these particular Neanderthals were somehow less capable or less intelligent than the more widely travelled populations we've spent tonight exploring. I think it means something more interesting than that. It suggests Neanderthal groups taken as a whole may have varied enormously in how open or how guarded their particular communities chose to be shaped by local geography, local resources, and quite possibly local temperament passed down within specific family lines, the same way certain modern communities today remain famously insular, while others just a short distance away build their entire identity around welcoming outsiders. Think about how differently that same 10-day distance might have been treated by a different kind of community entirely, perhaps even our own family back in Poland, the descendants of daughters who had already proven themselves willing to walk clear across a continent in search of a better valley, a better herd, a better life. For them, 10 days might have registered as barely any distance at all, a short, unremarkable trip compared to the journeys already written into their own family's deeper history. For Thorin's people, apparently it may as well have been an ocean. Two branches of the exact same species standing at what looks to us like a fairly similar starting point, and arriving at two entirely opposite answers to the exact same basic question. Do we go find out who else is out there, or do we stay exactly where we already know how to survive? Which of those two instincts feels more familiar to you if you are honest with yourself? I suspect most of us recognize a little of both inside our own personalities, depending on the day, the season of our lives, or simply who is asking. Now here is where this particular thread curves its way directly back to the family we've been following all night. When researchers compared Thorin's specific maternal genetic thread against the wider catalogue of known Neanderthal genomes, they found something that connects him surprisingly closely to our own small family here in Poland. His maternal lineage sits remarkably near the same branch carried by the mother and children we met earlier tonight, near enough that the team working on our Stajnia family's own genetic story felt compelled to address Thorin directly in their published research. And here is where a truly fascinating scientific disagreement enters the picture. The original researchers who first described Thorin argued his isolation explained the strange mismatch between his bones and his genes perfectly well on its own. But the team behind our own Stajnia family's story raised a different, more cautious possibility, suggesting that Thorin's currently accepted age itself might deserve a second, more careful look, particularly since the specific dating methods involved start losing precision dramatically. The further back in time you push them, exactly the same limitation we talked about earlier tonight regarding our own family's dating challenges. I find something quietly reassuring in watching two respected research teams openly professionally disagree with each other like this honestly. It would be easy to assume science hands down finished settled answers carved permanently in stone the moment a paper gets published. The truth looks considerably messier and considerably more honest than that. Real researchers working with truly difficult, ambiguous evidence sometimes reach different conclusions from the very same data, and rather than pretending otherwise, they publish their disagreements openly, invite scrutiny, and let the wider scientific community keep testing both possibilities until better evidence eventually settles the question. That is not science failing. That is science working exactly as it is supposed to. Have you ever been so confident about a memory, a factor version of the events, only to have new information arrive later and force you to admit the picture was more complicated than you originally assumed? I think most of us have experienced some smaller personal version of exactly what these researchers are working through with Thorin, that particular discomfort of holding two pieces of evidence that stubbornly refuse to agree with each other, and having the patience and the humility to sit with that tension rather than forcing a tidy resolution before you've actually earned one. There is something almost haunting about Thorin's entire story if you let yourself sit with it for a moment. An entire population, quite possibly numbering only a small handful of families, existing in near total isolation for 50,000 years, longer than the entire span of recorded human civilization several times over, and leaving behind, as far as we currently know, exactly one identified individual. One single man patiently excavated one grain of soil at a time, standing in for an entire lost world of people, whose names, whose songs, whose particular way of understanding their own small corner of France has otherwise vanished completely without a single other trace. That name researchers chose for him keeps circling back in my mind, and I do not think it was chosen carelessly. The last of a proud ancient line discovered only after everyone else who shared his particular story had already been gone for tens of thousands of years. Whoever picked that nickname understood exactly what they had found. I keep wondering what daily life must have actually felt like for that isolated community generation after generation, never once encountering an unfamiliar face from beyond their own small familiar circle. Did they even know other Neanderthals existed somewhere else across that same landscape? Did it matter to them one way or another? We will likely never know the answer to either question. And I think that particular uncertainty is worth sitting with, honestly, rather than rushing to fill in a comfortable story just because the silence feels uncomfortable. There is something worth noticing in the sheer scale of what 50,000 years of silence actually represents too. If you tried to count backward through that community's entire history, one generation at a time, grandparent to parent to child, you would need somewhere in the range of 2,000 consecutive generations, every single one of them living, loving, raising children, and eventually dying entirely within that same narrow circle without a single outside face ever joining them along the way. 2,000 generations is longer than the entire span of every named civilization most of us studied in school, combined several times over and repeated again. And at the end of all that time, all that quiet continuity, everything we currently know about their entire existence rests on 31 teeth, a fragment of jaw and 5 small bones from one single man's hand. So here is where all of this leaves us as we near the final stretch of tonight's story. We now know Neanderthal communities varied dramatically, some travelling vast distances across an entire continent, others remaining almost entirely sealed off from their nearest neighbours for 50,000 consecutive years. We know science itself remains gloriously honestly unfinished, with respected researchers still actively debating exactly how old certain evidence truly is. And we know that somewhere tangled into all of this complexity sits a maternal genetic thread connecting a lonely isolated man in France to a small, apparently far more connected family back in Poland. But there is one enormous question we still have not properly addressed tonight, one that reaches far beyond any single cave, any single family, any single isolated population. If Neanderthals eventually vanished from the world entirely, what actually happened to them? and why, despite that disappearance, does a small, unmistakable trace of exactly who they were still linger quietly inside nearly every person currently listening to this story? Let's answer that question properly now, because I think the real story turns out to be far gentler and far stranger than the version most of us grew up hearing. If you learned about Neanderthals in school, there is a decent chance you absorbed some version of a fairly dramatic narrative. Clever, adaptable modern humans arriving in Europe, outcompeting a slower, less capable species until the Neanderthals simply died out, pushed aside, defeated, extinguished. Tidy, simple. The kind of story that fits neatly into one paragraph of a textbook, complete with a dramatic illustration of a hunched, brutish figure fading into darkness, while an upright spear carrying modern human strides confidently into the light. I have to tell you, the evidence we actually have paints something considerably more complicated and considerably more moving than a simple story of one species winning and another one losing. Researchers who study this particular question today generally point towards several factors working together at once, rather than one single dramatic cause. Population scattered thin across an enormous landscape, exactly the kind of small fragmented communities we spent time with earlier tonight would have been especially vulnerable to bad luck. A run of harsh winters, a failed hunting season, a disease introduced from outside their immediate world. Add in the kind of narrowing genetic diversity we already discussed generation after generation of increasingly limited options for finding a partner outside your own closely related circle, and you have a population already operating with a dangerously thin margin for error long before any outside pressure ever entered the picture at all. Some researchers have even pointed toward a specific catastrophic event, a massive volcanic eruption near what is now southern Italy, sometime around 39,000 years ago, powerful enough to have thrown enormous amounts of ash and debris across a huge stretch of Europe, disrupting climate patterns and food supplies for years afterward. Whether that particular eruption delivered a final decisive blow or simply added one more brutal strain onto populations already stretched dangerously thin remains an open question. But it illustrates something important about how this story likely unfolded, not as one clean decisive turning point, but as a slow accumulation of pressures, each one individually survivable, stacking up against each other until survival itself became the exception rather than the rule. And then sometime around 50 to 60,000 years ago, that outside pressure arrived anyway in the form of our own ancestors spreading outward from Africa into territory Neanderthals had already called home for hundreds of thousands of years. Here is where the story gets truly interesting though, because what happened next was not primarily a war. When these two different kinds of humans encountered each other, likely somewhere in the region we now call the Middle East, a stretch of territory acting almost like a narrow doorway connecting Africa to the rest of the wider world, something considerably more intimate happened alongside whatever competition or conflict may have also occurred. They had children together. Repeatedly, it turns out, across multiple separate encounters in multiple different times and places as both populations continued spreading and shifting across the landscape over thousands of years. Try to picture what that first encounter might have actually looked like. Two groups of people, similar enough to recognize each other as something other than a wild animal, different enough to notice immediately that something was unusual. Curiosity probably at least as much as fear. Trade quite possibly tools, exchange gestures, attempted some rough, patient early version of communication, slowly built up over repeated encounters. And somewhere within all of that uncertain, careful contact, ordinary human attraction, the same pull that has always existed between people who find each other interesting, regardless of which particular group they technically belong to. I want you to sit with that for a moment because I think it fundamentally changes how we should picture the ending of this story. Neanderthals did not simply vanish defeated and erased. In a very real, very literal biological sense, they were folded into us, absorbed, blended, carried forward not as a separate species standing apart from our own, but as an actual permanent part of who we eventually became. Here is the proof, and it is sitting inside you right now, whether you have ever thought about it before or not. If your ancestry traces back to anywhere outside of Africa, there is a very good chance somewhere between 1 and 2% of your own personal genetic code came directly from Neanderthals. Not a metaphor, not a poetic flourish, an actual measurable scientifically confirmed inheritance quietly present in the cells of your own body at this exact moment. Have you ever taken one of those home genetic testing kits, the kind that mails you a small tube to spit into, promising to reveal your ancestry? Quite a few of them will now casually tell you your personal Neanderthal percentage, tucked in alongside details about which regions of the world your distant relatives likely came from. I find something almost comical about that. Honestly, an ancient, profound scientific mystery, one that took brilliant researchers literal decades to unravel, now delivered to ordinary people as a mildly interesting bullet point on a glossy report somewhere between your caffeine sensitivity and your predicted eye colour. If you have ever seen your own results and felt a small flicker of pride or mild disappointment over whether your particular percentage landed above or below average, you are not alone. There is something oddly personal about that number, even though almost none of us fully understand what it actually means once we see it. Try asking yourself, honestly, before tonight, would you have been able to explain where that percentage actually came from, or what it was quietly doing inside your own body this entire time? Interestingly, that particular inheritance is not evenly distributed across every population alive today. If your ancestry traces specifically back to East Asia, you likely carry a noticeably higher percentage of Neanderthal genetic material than someone of primarily European ancestry, something in the neighbourhood of 20% more. For a long time, that gap puzzled researchers considerably, since the original mixing between these two populations appears to have happened before European and East Asian lineages had even fully separated from each other. The explanation researchers eventually settled on involves a second, much later chapter of human migration, one that had nothing directly to do with Neanderthals at all. Around 10,000 years ago, waves of early farmers began spreading out of the Middle East into Europe, a population that, for reasons of their own separate history, happened to carry noticeably less Neanderthal ancestry than the hunter-gatherers already living across the European landscape. As those farming populations mixed into and gradually became the majority across much of Europe, they diluted the existing Neanderthal genetic signal there, while East Asian populations who received considerably less of that particular later wave kept a higher concentration of their original inheritance intact. It is a wonderfully unexpected reminder that even a story this ancient keeps getting quietly reshaped by chapters of human history that on the surface seem to have nothing to do with it at all. Now, what exactly did we inherit in practical terms? This is where the story gets, in my opinion, truly fascinating. Certain aspects of hair and skin, tendencies toward particular skin tones, particular patterns of tanning, even a documented connection to baldness in some populations trace back to these Neanderthal genes. Portions of our immune system, the machinery responsible for recognizing and fighting off certain infections, carry Neanderthal fingerprints as well. Likely because Neanderthal populations had already spent hundreds of thousands of years adapting to specific diseases present in Europe and Western Asia, diseases our own ancestors had never previously encountered before arriving in that same territory. Think of it a little like moving to a brand new city and immediately inheriting a detailed, well-tested local guidebook from someone who had already lived there for generations, which restaurants to trust, which neighborhoods to avoid after dark, which small shortcuts actually save you time. Our own ancestors arriving fresh into unfamiliar territory effectively inherited a biological version of that same guidebook, already field-tested against local threats they had never personally encountered before. Borrowing already tested, already working genetic solutions turned out to be a considerably faster shortcut than waiting for entirely new mutations to develop from scratch. The biological equivalent of learning from a knowledgeable local, instead of getting hopelessly lost figuring everything out completely from zero. There is even a documented Neanderthal contribution to how some people experience physical pain, a specific inherited variant connected to a slightly lower pain threshold in people who carry it. I have to admit there is something almost sweetly ironic about that particular detail. Somewhere in your own nervous system quietly influencing something as personal and immediate as how sharply you feel a stubbed toe, there may be a small ancient echo of an entirely different kind of human being, one who has been extinct for tens of thousands of years. Here is the detail I find most striking of all, though, and I promise you, it connects directly back to the very same researcher we met earlier tonight, the scientist whose pioneering work first made reading genetic material this ancient even possible in the first place. A few years ago, in the middle of a global pandemic that upended life for nearly everyone listening to this story right now, that same researcher, along with a colleague, made a discovery that briefly turned Neanderthal genetics into front-page news around the entire world. They found that a specific stretch of genetic material inherited directly from Neanderthals was strongly associated with a significantly higher risk of developing severe, potentially life-threatening symptoms from a virus that at the time had brought much of daily life to a complete standstill. In certain populations, as many as half of all people carried this particular inherited risk factor. But the story did not end there, and I think the second half matters just as much as the first. Later research uncovered a separate cluster of Neanderthal-derived genes that appeared to work in the opposite direction, entirely actually offering meaningful protection against the very same severe outcome found in roughly 1 out of every 5 people studied. 2 completely different genetic inheritances, both originally belonging to the exact same extinct species, quietly working against each other inside different people's bodies during one of the most disruptive global health crises many of us will hopefully ever personally experience. Does that not feel almost unbelievable to you? An ancient family walking across an Ice Age landscape tens of thousands of years before anyone had ever imagined anything resembling a virus under a microscope, unknowingly shaping how some of their distant descendants would fare during a pandemic that gripped the entire modern world just a handful of years ago. There is one more detail I want to leave you with, because out of everything we have covered tonight about this ancient inheritance, this particular one feels like it belongs most naturally beside the story we began this whole evening with. Researchers studying a massive collection of genetic and medical records recently identified a specific gene variant inherited from Neanderthals that appears in some women today. Women carrying this particular variant showed a measurably lower likelihood of experiencing miscarriage, along with a reduced tendency toward bleeding complications during pregnancy. On average, these same women also tended to have larger families. Think about that for a moment, sitting beside everything we already know about our own mother from earlier tonight, patiently raising 2 children of different ages, in that narrow cave generation after generation of mothers before her apparently doing exactly the same. It is entirely possible that some small quiet piece of the biological machinery helping mothers safely carry their own children into the world today traces directly back to women exactly like her, an inheritance with absolutely nothing symbolic or metaphorical about it, written directly into the actual cells of actual bodies, quietly protecting actual pregnancies right now. Tonight in homes you will probably never know anything else about. So here is where I think this part of the story actually lands. Neanderthals did not lose. They did not simply disappear, erased cleanly from the world, the way an extinct species in a museum display case might suggest. They ended, and yet somehow simultaneously, they also continued quietly folded into an entirely different species, carried forward inside the actual bodies of billions of people alive on this planet, at this exact moment, most of whom have never once thought about where a small piece of their own biology actually came from. I think we reach for the word extinction a little too easily, honestly, when what actually happened here looks considerably more like a kind of quiet merging. Extinction implies a clean total ending, a door shutting, completely nothing left behind on the other side of it. What the genetic evidence actually shows us looks more like two rivers meeting and combining into one single wider river, rather than one river simply drying up while the other continued on alone. The water from both original sources is still moving forward together, now indistinguishable to anyone glancing at the surface, but unmistakably present if you know to look closely enough at what the current is actually carrying. Have you ever wondered honestly what small invisible piece of your own body might be quietly carrying forward some ancient story? You will never fully know the details of not just the Neanderthal thread we've spent tonight exploring, but every other quiet inheritance folded into you, habits, features, tendencies traced back through countless generations of people whose names have long since been forgotten, each one still somehow present in some small way inside you right now. I think that question deserves a little more room to breathe than we have left tonight, but I hope it stays with you well after this particular story ends. There is something quietly comforting in that idea, at least to me. Nothing that mattered enough to survive ever really disappears completely. It simply changes shape, folds itself into whatever comes next, and keeps moving forward generation after generation, whether anyone downstream ever bothers to notice or not. Because that is precisely where we're headed now, back to the small cave in Poland, back to the mother, the boy, and the girl who started this entire journey with us to bring their story to its proper final ending. Let's go back there now one final time. Picture that same narrow crack in the limestone tucked into the hills of what would tens of thousands of years later come to be called southern Poland. The fire has burned down low by now, more ember than flame, throwing soft orange light across a ceiling blackened by countless fires before this one. Outside, the cold air still presses against the rock, patient, endless, the way it always does at this hour of the night. Somewhere far off, something moves quietly through the dark, a soft rustle of dry grass, a distant sound neither of us would recognize, though the family sleeping beside that fire would have known it instantly, the way you know the particular creak of your own house settling at night, without ever needing to think about it. The woman is still there. Her daughter is asleep now, tucked against her side, that same scrap of softened hide pulled snug around her small shoulders. Her son lies near her too, one hand curled loosely near his mouth, right where a small empty space now sits, where a tooth used to be tucked safely away in a fold of warm ash, near the edge of the fire, exactly where his mother placed it. She has no idea, of course, what any of this will eventually come to mean. She could not possibly know that her bloodline is about to travel further than she could ever imagine, carried outward, by daughters not yet born, all the way to distant mountains she will never see, distant coastlines she has no name for. She does not know that somewhere generations down, an unbroken maternal line, a woman just like her tucked into an entirely different cave, will one day be forced to make an unthinkable choice her own family will thankfully never have to face. She does not know about the lonely man in France, isolated for 50,000 years, carrying some faint echo of her own family's story inside him, or about the small piece of herself that will quietly, faithfully keep travelling forward for over 100,000 years, folded eventually into the bodies of people living in a world she could not possibly picture, warmed by light that carries no flame at all. She only knows this. The fire is warm enough. Her children are fed and safe and finally asleep, and for tonight that is the entire world complete and whole, exactly as it needs to be. Now let's step outside that firelight one more time, because I think you deserve to see how this particular story actually finds its way to you. Fast forward again past everything this family could not have imagined surviving, past the slow rise and fall of ice sheets, past the disappearance of the mammoth and the woolly rhinoceros from those hills, entirely past kingdoms and castles and farmers who would one day keep their horses in the very same hollow. This family once called home all the way to a quiet afternoon not so long ago at all. A researcher kneels in that same patch of dirt, brushing away the last of the soil, with a small, careful tool moving slower than you would think a person could move on purpose. And there it is again, small, pale, barely the size of your smallest fingernail, a tooth. Except now, unlike the very beginning of tonight's story, you actually understand what that small piece of enamel was about to reveal. Not simply a fact, not simply a date or a location or a species name written carefully into a research paper, a mother, 2 children, a bloodline that quietly stretched itself across an entire continent, carried forward by daughters willing to walk into the unknown generation after generation, long before anyone had ever thought to draw a single map. I keep thinking about something as we come to the end of this particular story, and I want to share it with you honestly the way I have tried to share everything else with you tonight. Science at its best does not simply catalogue bones. It does not simply measure teeth or count mutations or draw careful lines on a map, showing how far one small family travelled over 100,000 years. Underneath all of that careful, patient, sometimes tedious work, something considerably more tender is quietly happening. Researchers spending years of their own lives kneeling in cold dirt, painstakingly reconstructing not just where these people went, but who they actually were to each other. A mother's care, a family's resilience, a community's willingness to keep a badly injured man alive for years, for reasons that had nothing to do with practical survival at all. None of that had to survive. Bones rarely carry emotion, and yet somehow, carefully, patiently, piece by piece, this particular team of scientists managed to recover something that feels remarkably like love itself, buried in stone for longer than most of us can properly comprehend, waiting quietly in the dark for someone patient enough to finally come looking. I do not think that is a small accomplishment. I think it might be one of the most quietly beautiful things science has ever managed to do. I imagine somewhere tonight one of those researchers is at home in an ordinary house, doing something completely unremarkable, washing a dish, folding a piece of laundry, checking on their own sleeping child down the hall. And somewhere in the back of their mind, quietly, without any fanfare at all, sits the knowledge that they spent years of their own life helping an ancient mother finally be seen again, fully clearly for exactly who she was. That feels like a strange, wonderful kind of gift to give someone who has been gone for over 100,000 years. I hope if any of those researchers ever happen to watch a story like this one, they understand just how far their careful, patient work actually travelled. Let's gather up everything we found together tonight one more time before we let this particular story finally rest. We found a narrow, unremarkable little cave, later used to shelter farm horses. Nobody back then had the slightest idea what still lay sleeping beneath the dirt. We found 9 small teeth, patiently excavated across several difficult seasons, waiting decades in the quiet dark for the science capable of finally listening to what they had to say. We found a mother, and evidence strong enough to suggest quite plausibly that 2 of those teeth belonged to her own children, We found a bloodline that stretched from Poland to Spain all the way to the mountains between the Black Sea and the Caspian, carried outward by women brave enough to walk into unfamiliar territory, generation after generation, one ordinary decision at a time. We found a family who endured a changing climate, warmth fading into cold and back again, adapting patiently rather than simply enduring. We found tools built with a kind of quiet, careful craftsmanship that still honestly impresses me every time I think about it. We found a father and his teenage daughter thousands of miles away in Siberia, a quiet reminder that a father's devotion is exactly as old as a mother's, even if tonight's story belonged mostly to the women who carried it forward. We found proof that this species cared for its most vulnerable members, and honest evidence too that not every Neanderthal family's story ended nearly so gently. We found an isolated cousin in France cut off from the rest of his own kind for 50,000 years, and we found finally that this entire species never actually disappeared at all. It simply folded itself quietly into us, into your own body, into the very cells keeping you warm as you listen to this right now. That is not a small story. That is not a simple story. And it was never really a story about bones at all, was it? It was a story about a family, the same as any family doing the same things families have always done, protecting each other, teaching each other, occasionally failing each other, and somehow against truly extraordinary odds, managing to leave a piece of themselves behind for someone somewhere to eventually find. Maybe that is why a story like this one lands so differently than most history usually does. It is not really about kings or wars or dates worth memorizing for a test. It is about a mother making sure her children were warm enough. It is about someone teaching a child how to strike a stone just right patiently more than once. It is about a community deciding quietly without ever writing it down anywhere that a person's worth was not measured only by what they could still contribute. Those are not ancient concerns. Those are the exact same quiet concerns, sitting somewhere in your own life tonight, whether you realized it or not, before you pressed play on this particular story. Somewhere in your own family, whether you know the details or not, someone once made a similarly quiet, unremarkable choice that ended up mattering more than they could have possibly known at the time. Someone stayed when leaving might have been easier. Someone taught a skill patiently to a child who did not yet appreciate the gift they were being given. Someone kept a fire going in whatever form fire takes in your own family's particular story, long enough for the next generation to find their own way to keep it burning. You're in your own small way already part of a story, exactly like the one we told tonight, whether anyone ever writes it down or not. I hope wherever you are right now, whatever room you're lying in, no matter how heavy your eyes have started to feel, some small piece of this particular family's story stays with you a little while longer. I hope the next time you happen to see an ordinary crack in a hillside, an unremarkable little cave, a patch of ground that looks like nothing at all, some small part of you wonders quietly what might still be sleeping underneath it, waiting patiently for someone curious enough to come looking. There is something almost dizzying about holding a span of time this large in your mind for very long, 100,000 years stretched out between one small fire in a Polish cave and the exact room you are lying in right now. Almost every single person who has ever lived across that entire span is now completely forgotten their names, their voices, their particular way of laughing, gone as thoroughly as if they had never existed at all. And yet here we are, still telling one small fragment of one small family's story, still finding it worth the telling all these years later. If that does not count as a kind of quiet immortality, I am not sure what would. Thank you honestly for spending this particular night with me. Stories like this one only really work because someone on the other side is actually willing to slow down, dim the lights, and listen all the way to the end, and I do not take that for granted, not even a little. I know there are countless things you could have spent tonight watching instead, and countless other ways you could have spent the last few hours before finally closing your eyes. Choosing to spend that time here with a small family who lived and loved more than 100,000 years ago means something to me more than a quick line at the end of a video can really express. Whether this was the first story of mine you have ever heard, or whether you have been quietly returning night after night for a while now, I am simply glad you are here for this particular one. If this story gave you even a small piece of what I hoped it would, a little wonder, a little comfort, a little company in the quiet, I would love it if you considered sharing that with someone else who might need exactly the same thing tonight. Maybe someone who has had a difficult week and could use an hour of gentle distraction. Maybe someone who, like you, simply loves the quiet feeling of drifting off to sleep while learning something they never expected to learn. And if you are not already following along for more nights like this one, I would be glad to have you back the next time I bring one of these stories to life. There is always another family, another cave, another quiet corner of history waiting patiently to be uncovered, and I would love nothing more than to share the next one with you too. For now though, let the fire in that little Polish cave burn all the way down. Let the woman rest. Let her children sleep exactly the way children have always slept, safe, warm, and utterly unaware of just how far their own small family was about to travel. Let the embers settle into a soft, quiet orange, then dimmer still, then nearly gone. Let the cold air outside keep pressing gently against the stone the way it always has, the way it always will. Let the narrow little cave hold its silence a while longer, patient, unhurried, the way it has already held its silence for more than 100,000 years. And maybe if you let yourself, let a little of that same stillness settle over you too, right where you are lying now. Let your own room grow quiet. Let your own breathing slow just slightly the way it naturally does right before sleep finally arrives. You do not need a fire tonight. You do not need a narrow crack in the limestone to keep you safe until morning. You simply need to let go a little at a time, the same patient way that Mother once let her own eyes finally shut, trusting the dark, trusting the walls around her, trusting that tomorrow would still be there waiting exactly as it always had been before. Somewhere very far back along an unbroken thread stretching more than 100,000 years, a woman shut her eyes beside a dying fire, certain of very little, except that her children were warm and fed and safe beside her. That is not such a small thing to hold on to even now, perhaps especially now. Sleep well wherever you are. I will be right here waiting quietly with the next story whenever you're ready to hear it.